Thank you. That ends topical questions, and the next item of business is a statement by Paul Wheelhouse on the second report on policies and proposals RPP2. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. I now call on Paul Wheelhouse. Minister, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today I lay before Parliament the Scottish Government's draft second report on proposals and policies for meeting Scotland's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. This report is in accordance with sections 35 and 36 of the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009 and builds on the package of measures set out in the first report on proposals and policies, or RPP1. The report updates the analysis while extending the timeframe to cover targets for 2023 to 2027. As a draft, it is now available for consideration by the Scottish Parliament for a 60-day period, after which we will publish a final version. An online consultation facility is also available on the Scottish Government's website. Colleagues, there is no doubt in my mind that climate change poses one of the greatest threats to the world as we know it. Global mean temperatures continue to rise, and we know that current global pledges for emissions cuts will be insufficient to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Left unchecked, current global emissions trends put the world on a path towards 4 degrees or possibly more of warming within a century. Let us be clear, such a change will deliver damaging impacts on populations across the globe and introduce new security risks associated with international resource conflicts. Colleagues, we have a moral responsibility to act. Presiding Officer, we think of climate change as a problem that is far off in time and only in far-off places, but we are already seeing evidence of Scotland's own climate changing. In 2011, rainfall in Scotland was some 36% more than the average for the period between 1961 and 1990. The experience of recent years has shown that climate change and severe weather events are already impacting negatively upon many aspects of our society, including increased frequency of flooding, with impacts on residential areas and business premises, disruption to travel, increased health risks, lower agricultural productivity, threats to biodiversity, including new plant and tree pests, and rising river temperatures affecting spawning salmon. Acting both locally and globally to reduce emissions now, by moving to a low-carbon economy, is self-evidently crucial to reduce the potentially severe economic and social impacts of climate change on present and future generations. We can be justifiably proud of our overall progress to date, achieved despite the obvious constraints on policy in this place arising from key powers being reserved to the Westminster Parliament. Our Climate Change Act is still the most ambitious piece of climate change legislation anywhere in the world, and unlike those for the UK, we have set statutory annual targets, and they include emissions from international aviation and shipping. So let me repeat, the Scottish Government is fully committed to the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that the Act sets. We have set ourselves challenging targets, and it is to the great credit of this whole Parliament that we remain committed to achieving them. We accept that human interventions have created and worsened climate change. It is our responsibility to future generations to take action in response. The challenge is by no means an easy one. It would have been far easier to set targets that ignored climate science or showed a lower level of ambition, but which would have been straightforward for ministers to meet. But that is not our chosen path. Last October, I reported to Parliament that our first climate change target for 2010 had been missed, largely as a result of increased energy demand for heating due to the exceptionally bad weather Scotland experienced in Q1 and Q4 of that year. This was replicated in England and Wales. The package of measures set out in the draft report published today shows that it is possible to compensate for that shortfall as we move towards becoming a truly low-carbon economy. While we set out to meet annual targets, I believe we are also charting a course to meet our obligations on cumulative emissions too. In terms of where we see our role in addressing climate change, Scotland does not lack ambition. As a nation, we can all take pride in that. We sit at the top of the emissions reduction table for the EU15. All are Kyoto Protocol signatories. In 2010, Scotland's unadjusted greenhouse gas emissions had fallen by 22.8%, compared to 20.8% for the UK, 8.5% for the EU15, and 14.3% across the entire EU27. Scotland's progress shows what can be achieved with a strong political commitment, groundbreaking legislation, and a comprehensive framework for action. After adjustment for the EU ETS, Scotland's emissions fell by 24.3% by 2010. or more than halfway towards meeting the 42% reduction target set for 2020 in the Climate Change Act. Indeed, the draft RPP2 identifies ways in which Scotland could deliver significantly more emissions abatement than our independent advisers, the Committee on Climate Change, suggested was achievable and an appropriate Scottish contribution to global action. Of course, the CCC's figures also assumed an EU-wide emissions reduction target of 30% for 2020, and this is yet to be realised. My Ministerial colleagues and I have a collective responsibility to take action across all areas of government. As we move through the next decade and beyond, we need to intensify our efforts in improving the energy efficiency of buildings, supporting the uptake of low-carbon vehicles, investing in improving public transport, investing in sustainable and active travel, and reducing the waste we produce and being smarter about what we do with it. We also need to make the most of opportunities afforded for good stewardship of Scotland's ecosystems. This will involve deploying best practice in agriculture while improving the ability of our peatlands and woodlands to lock in carbon. I believe we are making significant progress on many fronts. In transport, we are following through in our manifesto in developing the infrastructure to support electric cars and increasing the proportion of transport spend that goes on low-carbon, active and sustainable travel. In our homes and communities, our national retrofit programme builds on a highly successful area-based programme. That programme has already seen more than 700,000 households across Scotland offered assistance through the Universal Home Insulation Scheme. We are on track to achieve 10,000 hectares per annum of new woodland planting. This will quadruple Scotland's woodland planting rate from a low point following transition to the current SRDP. As part of this, more than 9,000 hectares were planted in 2011-12, and this is almost 3 times the total planting achieved across the rest of the UK. We are laying firm foundations for much greater long-term transformational change in the way we use and generate our energy. Decarbonisation of electricity generation will be a key driver of our progress towards a low-carbon economy. By 2011, renewables generated 36.3% of Scotland's electricity needs, smashing our 31% interim target years ahead of schedule, and putting renewables on track to produce equivalent to 100% of Scotland's electricity demand by 2020. However, we can go further. Earlier today in Aberdeen, the First Minister announced an ambitious new decarbonisation target for Scotland for 2030 of 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. This target is in line with the recommendation of the Committee on Climate Change and Westminster's Energy and Climate Change Committee when it stated it is right to prioritise the decarbonisation of the electricity system because it is likely to deliver the most cost-effective route to meeting our 2050 climate change targets. And today also sees the publication of our draft outline heat vision, which sets our ambition for a largely decarbonised heat sector by 2030. This sets out how, by using low-carbon and renewable heat resources, we can supply heat efficiently and cost-effectively to consumers, reducing emissions and addressing fuel poverty. We also need to reduce demand for heat by better insulating our buildings and changing our behaviour to use less energy for heating. I believe that the draft RPP2 contains a comprehensive package of policies and proposals that can deliver the required emissions reductions to meet our climate change targets. However, our society's transition to a low-carbon economy does not just require action by government. Scotland needs partnerships between the public sector, private and social enterprises. We need communities engaging and taking action together. And most importantly, we need the participation of individuals and families across Scotland. The Scottish Government fully recognises its role to lead the transition, to help people of Scotland make informed choices about how we live and work, and to ensure we seize all opportunities that a low-carbon future offers both to Scotland's economy and its society. I am confident that a low-carbon economy will bring significant economic benefits and opportunities for our communities. Businesses and industry will help to protect our environment and our wildlife. The draft report presented today sets a pathway to realising these benefits, and Parliament now has the opportunity to help build that pathway. I welcome the opportunity to engage with members today and at the committees considering the draft RPP2, and the Scottish Government's commitment to a low-carbon future has provided certainty and is delivering jobs and investment across Scotland. However, we cannot be complacent in our approach, and this report demonstrates that we are setting stretching targets for ourselves and committed to doing all that we can to deliver action to ensure those targets are met. Colleagues, we are very clear about the scale of the challenge, and today I commend to you our draft report and its updated strategy for action to deliver on Scotland's ambition for emissions reductions. Thank you.
Thank you. The Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement, and I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we will move on to the next item of business. But there are quite a few requests already, so if questions could be kept as succinct as possible, I'd be most grateful. It would be helpful if members who do want to ask a question could press the request to speak buttons now. And I call on Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First, can I apologise for being late. It is a large document, but I thank the Minister for the advance copy of the statement and the document. This is the start of the parliamentary scrutiny, placing a serious responsibility on parliamentarians to ensure that the new plan is credible, robust and will enable Scotland to deliver its climate change targets. And we know that this is challenging. Scotland failed to meet its first emissions target, and the Scottish Government's own Director of Energy and Climate Change admitted that at current progress, Scotland would miss all its legally binding emissions targets. Can I ask, does the Director of Energy and Climate Change now think we are on course? We need a step change, and we need a move away from proposals into deliverable policies. The statement does highlight where progress is being made, and we can support this, but it doesn't say enough about what additional substantial measures will be taken to meet our climate change ambitious targets. Disappointingly, the statement today gives little assurance to Parliament that the shortcomings of RPP1 will be addressed and that it lacks sufficient new and additional policies to really make the difference, particularly in housing and transport. The Minister cannot address these issues alone. And can the Minister say which commitments he has gained from Cabinet members that will compensate for our lack of progress, both in this year's budget and in future years? And against the backdrop of rolling back on Egypt, watering down new building standards and planning to use public subsidies to support inefficient large biomass, is there enough evidence of policies in this document that will make the difference required? Minister.
I'm grateful to the member for her comments. However, I would just point out that perhaps it's part of the statement that she missed. We did make specific reference to the fact that I'm comfortable this document does address the shortcomings in RPP1 in respect of having missed the target in 2010, the point she refers to. In terms of the reference to the Director, David Wilson, David Wilson has been closely involved in preparation of this document, and as the member will see from the detailed information in the back of the RPP, that we are on track to meet our targets. And so the comments which were made and referred to as being current were last summer, when we were doing consultation with stakeholders. And I think it's a testament to the fact that work has been done between then and now. We've taken on board many points that have been raised by stakeholders, and we have done considerable work to deliver a report which does show us on track to meet our targets. In terms of the specifics, the tables at the back of the RPP clearly show that together all the policies and proposals described would allow us to meet each annual target from 2013 to 2027. There is some flexibility to decide which proposals should be adopted and which options can be held in reserve in case any actions prove less effective than expected at this time. Equally, if progress exceeds expectations, some proposals may not be necessary at all. So Parliament now has the opportunity to offer its views, and I'd welcome the views from the member on the proposed policies and funding options, and I look forward to constructive dialogue with her.
Jamie McGregor.
Thank you. What action are ministers taking to promote the green council tax discount suggested by the Scottish Conservatives, whereby people who can demonstrate their homes are insulated to a high standard will get a discount on their council tax? Also, what is he doing to increase take-up of the Scottish Government's own universal home insulation scheme? And more widely, what action will the Government take to act upon the recommendation of the Economy and Tourism Committee that there should be a one-stop shop approach and hotline for all the energy efficiency schemes which are available? The Minister mentioned also supporting the uptake of low-carbon vehicles and electric cars. In addition to this, what support is the Scottish Government giving to hydrogen fuel technology? And lastly, can the Minister assure this Parliament that none of his suggested measures will have an adverse effect on Scottish business?
Minister.
There's quite a long list of questions there from the member, presiding officer, and obviously time constrains me. In terms of the UHIS, just pointed to the fact in my statement that 700,000 households have to date been given assistance, offered assistance in terms of that programme, and so clearly it is having a substantial benefit. There are more than 100,000 households who have actually been assisted with actual implementation of energy efficiency measures such as boiler replacements and other measures. So I feel we are making considerable progress. That's not to say we're complacent. We realise that the supply of domestic heat and energy efficiency are key issues going forward, and I hope when you've had time, I appreciate the members have not had time to look at the detailed report, that there will be some comfort there in terms of the detail we're providing on those policies. In terms of Green Council tax, I'm happy to come back to the member on that point in terms of actual performance and what we might recommend in terms of improvement in take-up of it. It is a scheme administered by local authorities and not by government directly, but I will look into that matter, and I'm happy to discuss with him issues to do with hydrogen fuel technology. It's clearly an issue of importance to him.
Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to ask the Scottish Government if the RPP2 will help reach early conclusions about the measured rate of greenhouse gas emissions from deep peat. When will this research lead to physical peat bog restoration across Scotland, which can be funded not only by the public purse, but also by private land managers and wind farm developers to achieve a major addition to our policy approach?
Minister.
Firstly, can I recognise that I know that Rob Gibson has a long-standing and considerable interest in peatlands, and I hope that he will be pleased with the commitment in our document to extend proposals for restoring up to 20,000 hectares of peatland per annum, and indeed we will keep a watching brief on the science and to understand whether we can have scope to increase that further. We have allocated £1.7 million to Scottish Natural Heritage, and we're working with them to develop a peatland plan for Scotland, which will look at many of the practical issues about implementing our proposals. And this will include encouraging land managers to come forward with proposals for peatland restoration. Funding is available in the Scotland Rural Development Programme, but we recognise that more needs to be done to secure much greater investment in peatlands, and I'm happy to take forward any ideas that the committee, Rural Affairs Committee, and indeed the member have for engagement with business and other partners to encourage a stronger stream of income into restoring our peatlands.
Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I also thank the Minister for early sight of the statement. And can the Minister give reassurance to the Chamber about what research funding provision there is for us to move faster towards the low-carbon economy to which we are determined to get, and specifically whether the assessment of downstream projects, as discussed in committee previously, is now included in the RPP2?
Minister.
That's certainly an area that I know that Claudia Beamish has considerable interest in from discussions we've had at committee. I think in terms of research funding, clearly we have opportunities to try and influence research going forward, but that is much research funding in Scotland is obtained through competitive funding rounds, and in various strands, various sectors such as aquaculture, we are trying to take a more concerted view, which might include looking at the impacts of climate change on our aquaculture sector and aquaculture sector and wild fisheries, as we have discussed at committee. I'm happy to meet with the member to discuss what any specific proposals that she may have for looking at our wider research requirements to understand what's happening in terms of climate change in Scotland, and indeed to investigate what measures might be appropriate to deal with mitigation.
Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Officer. Scottish Government proposals go further than those called for by the UK Committee on Climate Change. Can the Minister outline why the Scottish Government is taking this additional action?
Minister.
Well, the member raises an important point. Since the Independent Committee on Climate Change gave us their advice on the 2023 to 2027 annual targets in July 2011, the historical data on greenhouse gases has been revised upwards in relation to Scotland's emissions. In addition, our understanding of the science of carbon emissions has very much improved, and it's now clear that if we did not act, our non-traded emissions would be approximately 4 megatons a year greater by 2027 than CCC had actually suggested. So this is increase the challenge we face in meeting our climate change targets, but I'm determined we rise to this, and we are trying to, as a government, adopt best practice in terms of measurement of our emissions, and looking forward to the fact that annual reports are judged on that more up-to-date picture of emissions baseline, and making sure that we have an accurate forecast for those.
Rudy Grant.
Under the Energy Bill legislative consent motion, the Scottish Government is ceding emissions performance standards for fossil fuel plant to the UK Government. How does this impact on their ability to cut carbon emissions from this type of generation?
Minister.
Well, clearly the member will have noted from my statement the important news today that Scotland has set the first decarbonisation target for electricity generation. And clearly this government has aspirations to have full control of our energy policy in Scotland. But it's an important step in putting in a decarbonisation target to set a sense of direction. I'm very aware from discussions I have had with energy interests in the context of this portfolio that the clarity and certainty over our policy is key. A very strong commitment that this government has given to renewables is one of the key planks which has attracted inward investment to Scotland in the sector, and I think today's announcement of a decarbonisation target does further add weight to that. But I'm happy if the member has specific points she wants to raise with me, I'm happy to discuss them with her.
Graham Day.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In order to hit our climate change targets, it's accepted that everyone, government, business and individuals, will have to play a part. How, in practice, will the Government seek to encourage and ultimately bring about behavioural change amongst individuals at home, at work and in their travel choices?
Minister.
The Scottish Government does acknowledge that behaviour is crucial in meeting our targets, and indeed some of the comments that have been received from Stop Climate Chaos and G6 environmental stakeholders have been about ensuring that our strategy takes account of the percentage of which our targets will be delivered by individuals and communities. We're already supporting a number of initiatives which help to influence low-carbon behaviours, such as the National Greener Scotland campaign, which the member may have seen, the Climate Challenge Fund for community projects to reduce carbon, and the Better Business Guidance for businesses on engaging staff in reducing emissions. And we'll shortly publish the Low Carbon Scotland Behaviours Framework, which will certainly outline the strategic approach the Scottish Government and its key partners will take over coming years in successfully influencing low-carbon behaviour.
Patrick Harvey.
Deputy Presiding Officer, there's lost ground to catch up on, which the Minister acknowledges, something in the order of just over 1 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent after the failing to meet the first target. Is it right, am I reading this document right, that those excess emissions are going to be compensated by some unspecified policies at some unspecified time between now and 2027? Shouldn't last year's failing result in action this year and next?
Minister.
The member is right to cite the amount which missed our targets by in 2010 of about a megatonne. What I would hope that the member will see when he has the chance to look at the detail of the report is to see that we, over the period up to 2027, more than compensating for these emissions. And indeed, if we are successful, as a government has a policy to push Europe to a 30% target, we will break our targets in every single year, so we will be in a very strong position. But it's important that we do take account of the cumulative emissions. I know that is an issue that the member has raised with me in private discussions, and I assure him that I am very much conscious of our responsibilities, not only in terms of meeting annual targets, but to deliver a report that shows us meeting our cumulative emissions over the period in question.
Maureen Watt.
I'm sure the Minister will want to join with me in congratulating the people of Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, who are amongst the most energy conscious in Scotland, where almost a third of adults have either installed or are thinking of installing renewable energy systems. But does the Minister believe that a huge reduction in carbon emissions can be achieved by a modal shift from air to rail travel? And does he believe that the Westminster Government's HS2 proposals lack ambition and urgency?
Minister.
The member raises a very important point. I'm very happy to praise Aberdeenshire Council and indeed Aberdeen for their action. I am aware that in the case of Aberdeenshire Council, they've done a lot of work to try and encourage modal shift among their employees who are coming to work and looking at options to try and help them work locally instead of travelling into a central location. I certainly think in relation to HS2, there's no doubt that HS2 has the potential to offer very substantial carbon savings, but only if the high-speed line is extended all the way to Scotland. Journey times by rail would be dramatically reduced, such that we would expect it to have a substantial share, if not the majority share, of the rail air market between Scotland and London. And that is why we're pressing the UK Government, as was outlined by Keith Brown earlier in topical questions, for joint work towards Scotland's inclusion in a full UK high-speed rail network. And we will work with the UK Government to achieve this.
Malcolm Chisholm.
The Minister accepted that the previous RPP placed too great an emphasis on proposals, especially in the transport sector. So can you tell us what proportion of the total transport effort in this RPP is focused on policies? And given that emissions in transport are now greater than the baseline year of 1990, does he accept that those policies require to be radical demand-side policies to halt the inexorable rise in vehicle kilometres and vehicle emissions?
Minister.
An important point. I would say in relation to the latter point that while I recognise many stakeholders have called for demand management proposals to be included and to be converted to policies, it's true to say that this far out from achieving our targets 2023 to 2027, we have considerable scope to look at technological advances, other measures, and I say if we are successful in delivering emissions through other sources, that does take pressure off us in terms of introducing policies which might be more difficult for the public to buy or indeed to implement at a local level. In terms of the point about RPP1, the report that I've produced today shows that all proposals need to be converted into policies to meet targets. For 2013, there is still a number of proposals to be converted that are not mentioned at this stage. It's certainly it's true to say that we will be working as a government across portfolio. I've been having bilaterals with ministers in relevant portfolios to see what we can do to speed up the achievement of our targets and to look at implementing our proposals.
Alex Ferguson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In his statement, the Minister rightly highlights the importance of this whole Parliament remaining committed to achieving these challenging targets, and I entirely agree with that. However, he then infers in his statement that progress to date would have been made much better had it not been for, and I quote, key powers being reserved to Westminster, which is odd because he then rightly blames the adverse weather for the failure to reach the targets. Can I ask him whether he would agree that, on this subject of all subjects, mischief-making statements like that do little to encourage the cross-party consensus on which I think we all agree is important to achieve these targets?
Minister. I have to say I simply disagree with Mr Ferguson. I have enormous respect for him as an individual, but I think he actually lets himself down with that question. It is very true to say that in important areas of the economy, such as energy, in terms of road transport, where there are important powers reserved to Westminster, both in terms of vehicle excise duty, taxation policy, and indeed, when it comes to energy, the regulatory framework and charging structure for transmission across the UK, that these are areas which the UK has an enormous influence on the success of policy in Scotland. And it simply is not true to say that Westminster has no influence on our achievement of targets. And I would simply say in relation to the bad weather, the point he makes, that in Scotland, like Wales and England, there's no king canute that can hold back the weather. All three countries suffered similarly in that winter of 2010, and all three suffered in terms of their emissions targets.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The report sets out a number of energy efficiency measures in the home which help to reduce not just carbon emissions but also fuel bills. Can the Minister outline what importance he attaches to that sort of win-win measure in the coming years so that we can achieve our targets but also help alleviate fuel poverty in Scotland?
Minister.
That's an extremely important point that Marco Biaggi makes. Clearly, this government has two sets of statutory binding targets, one on fuel poverty and one on climate change targets. Clearly, where there is investment in areas such as energy efficiency and providing important sources of heat for domestic properties, that allows us not only to achieve our carbon emission targets but also deliver on our fuel poverty strategy. And I think that's just one example. There are very many others where investment in woodlands can help with biodiversity but can also help with public health and well-being issues as well. So there are many synergies in policy terms, and it shouldn't just be seen in isolation as achieving our carbon emission targets.
Thank you. I'm afraid I need quicker questions and answers, or I won't be able to fit in everyone. Sarah Boyack.
Carried out on the impact of the public duty in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and will the Sustainable Procurement Bill include provision for public sector to set carbon targets in the contracts they issue?
Minister.
I'm happy to come back to the member on that specific point. Certainly in the context of biodiversity, where there's a similar approach being talked of within the Scottish Biodiversity Committee, I would want to see some examples of perhaps where there are already organisations that are reporting on their biodiversity strategy, and similarly for the carbon duty, if you like, the public duty in respect of emissions. I would want to see perhaps a good practice being developed as to how those companies and organisations report their performance. Clearly, organisations like Scottish Natural Heritage, which is clearly an agency of government, are already doing great things in terms of reporting their annual performance in relation to targets. And I would look to see if we can roll that kind of good practice out to other organisations. But I'm happy to meet with her to see if she has any ideas herself as to how we can take that forward.
Jim Hume.
With a 3% rise since 1990 from homes, does the Minister accept that we need commitments and not assumptions, and will he assure the Chamber that private landlords will have to improve the energy efficiency of their homes by 2018?
Minister.
Well, that's indeed one area where the Government has already taken action to extend the availability of funding to private sector tenants to enable them to have access to improved energy efficiency and domestic heating systems. But certainly I would recognise that the residential sector is one area where we have struggled to reduce emissions, and clearly it's a high priority for the Government. I hope when the member has a chance to read the detail of the RPP2, he will see that we are making some ambitious moves in relation to both heat and indeed energy efficiency. And it is tied in with us trying to ensure that we have a sustainable source of electricity and energy for the people of Scotland.
Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Your page 102 state that the regulation of private and social housing should start to contribute in 2014 and contribute 152 kilotonnes by 2027. Can you confirm that you intend to set minimum energy performance standards for all houses in all sectors, and could you maybe outline how that could be supported financially?
Minister.
I can confirm to the member that there are ongoing discussions regarding how we can deliver improved efficiency standards across all forms of housing in Scotland, and happy to update her in due course as to the outcome of those discussions.
And finally, Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the emphasis in the statement on active travel. Therefore, does the Minister agree that we need sustained investment in cycling infrastructure to deliver segregated routes such as we have on the continent, so that we can meet our climate change obligations at the same time as meeting our ambitious cycling target of 10% of all journeys by bicycle by 2020?
Minister.
I certainly agree with Jim Eadie that it is important. We have to recognise that there are some disincentives to individuals to take up active travel and cycling. I know for myself I would feel slightly intimidated driving through the centre of Edinburgh or Glasgow on a daily commute. However, we are looking at means by which we can make cycling more easy to adopt for individuals. There are projects which are being funded through the Climate Challenge Fund at a local level in places like Creetown and Dumfries and Galloway, where individuals are being given advice about how to use cycling as a means to get to travel, giving them support in terms of lending them bikes initially so they can adopt that lifestyle choice, and also then helping them to move on to taking on that modal shift permanently. But I do accept that there is a need to try and look at safety issues in relation to encouraging more cyclists to take up active travel.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the statement, and we now move on to the next item of business, which is Stage 3 Proceedings on the Scottish Civil Justice Council and Criminal Legal Assistance Bill, and I will give a minute for members to change their seats. Thank you. The next item of business is the Stage 3 proceedings on the Scottish Civil Justice Council and Criminal Legal Assistance Bill, and in dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, which is SP Bill 13A, the marshalled list, that is SP Bill 13A-ML, and the groupings, that is SP Bill 13A to G. The division bell was sounded and proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes for the first division of the afternoon. The period of voting for the first division will be 30 seconds, and thereafter I will allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after a debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate or on any group of amendments should press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible after I call the group, and members should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. Group 1, Roll of Council, and I call Amendment 9 in the name of Jenny Marra, group with Amendments 10 and to 12, and ask Jenny Marra to move Amendment 9 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendment 9 is grouped with consequential amendments 10 and 12. Members will be aware that I lodged an identical amendment at Stage 2. Part of this amendment seeks to ensure that Scottish ministers are the recipients of Council recommendations for the development of the civil justice system, and that ministers, as well as the Lord President, can request the Council to provide advice on civil justice matters of its choosing. As I said at Stage 2 in these proceedings, the crux of the issue, as it has been put by eminent public law professors in Scotland, is that the Council currently has the duty to recommend changes to the civil justice system to the Lord President as head of the Council, but not to Scottish ministers, who have ultimate responsibility for civil justice policy. The professor's main concern is that this power is wide-ranging and open to interpretation, and we share that concern, and do not want to see a situation arise where recommendations for civil justice reforms are contained within the Council because there is no duty to involve ministers, and therefore parliamentary scrutiny in that process. At Stage 2, the Cabinet Secretary stated this amendment was unnecessary because the Council's duty to advise the Lord President should be understood within the context of the Lord President's statutory function for making and maintaining arrangements for securing the efficient disposal of business in the Scottish courts. However, this statutory function in itself does little to clarify the uncertainty that the bill provides for. By placing the obligation of the Council towards Scottish ministers on an equal footing it has to the Lord President, we believe we can ensure the bill maintains the principle that civil justice policy is privilege of ministers to make and Parliament to scrutinise. The second part of the amendment puts a duty on the Council to actively consider how to make the civil justice system in Scotland fairer, more accessible and more efficient. Throughout the evidence sessions in committee, we found that accessibility and fairness were still major barriers that were experienced by those entering or operating in the civil justice system. And it is only right, therefore, that we use the opportunity with the creation of this new Council to put accessibility and fairness at the forefront of its considerations. Because it is, after all, court users who are paying for the Council through an increase to their fees. To sum up, Presiding Officer, Amendments 9, 10 and 12 will remove much of the uncertainty the bill creates in relation to the responsibility for the civil justice system and ensure that court users are at the forefront of the work it undertakes. I move the amendments in my name.
Thank you. Annabel Goldie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Might I explain to the Chamber that my colleague Margaret Mitchell has been involved in all the proceedings of this bill. Sadly, her mother died recently and she is unable to take part in the debate today. It may ensure, Deputy Presiding Officer, that my contributions are marked by brevity. Can I say in relation to the amendments put forward by Jenny Marra that we're not without sympathy for these amendments, but I note particularly in relation to Amendment 9 her desire to compel the Scottish Civil Justice Council to provide advice to ministers. And I think that's a nub of the issue, that to me it's not that we compel the advice to be given, it would be much more interesting to compel the advice to be taken, but no statute is ever going to achieve that. And I think we should accept that the body is constituted as a responsible body, and therefore we feel that this amendment would introduce an unwelcome encumbrance, an additional obligation that we think is unnecessary, because the bill does actually, by other sections, seek to cover the issues that Jenny Marra is concerned about. And so for these reasons, we will not be supporting her amendment.
Cabinet Secretary.
Jenny Mara raises an important constitutional issue, and I appreciate her desire to ensure that the Parliament and Government remain the determinants of civil justice policy. However, the Council is predominantly an advisory body. It will advise the Lord President on improvements to the civil justice system to assist him in the discharge of the statutory responsibilities he already has. It will also assist the Court of Session by preparing draft rules of court. The bill provides that the Council may advise ministers, and I see no need to compel it to do so. Parliament and ministers can take the Council's advice into account if we so wish. As I stated during Stage 2 proceedings, when these amendments by Jenny Mara were considered, there is nothing in the bill that will affect the capacity of the Executive, the Legislature and the Judiciary to continue to make those decisions which appropriately rest with them. And I understand the Lord President also made this clear when he appeared before the Justice Committee to discuss the bill. I hope the Chamber will therefore be reassured that upon the creation of the Council, the Government will remain the body responsible and responsible to Parliament for the development of wider justice policy. Ms Mara has said previously that the bill should be beyond interpretation on this matter. I believe that it is, and that it is appropriate that responsibility for the Council rests with the Lord President as provided for in the bill. Margaret Mitchell lodged an amendment at Stage 2 for the purpose of clarifying that the bill would not require ministers to consult the Council on policy matters. That amendment was withdrawn following my assurances that nothing in the bill will interfere with the powers of ministers or Parliament. And I would submit that Ms Mara's amendments, which would require the Council to advise ministers at their request, would in fact introduce an element of doubt by suggesting that the Council must consider matters that properly sit with ministers or Parliament. With regard to the proposal to place a duty on the Council to consider how to make the civil justice system more fair, accessible and efficient, the bill already provides that the Council must have regard to the principle that the civil justice system should be fair, accessible and efficient. This guiding principle, I believe, goes further than Jenny Mara's amendment, and I would therefore urge Jenny Mara to withdraw her Amendment 9 and not to move Amendments 10 and 12.
Call Jenny Mara to wind up and indicate if you wish to press or withdraw.
It is for the avoidance of doubt, Presiding Officer, and for further clarification that I have tabled these amendments, and for reasons I explained as I opened, I intend to press them.
Thank you. In that case, the question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. This is the first division, and therefore I will suspend Parliament for 5 minutes. We will now proceed with the division on Amendment 9. This is a 30-second division and members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 9 in the name of Jenny Mara is yes 41, no 77. There were no abstentions and the amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendment 10 in the name of Jenny Mara, which has already been debated with amendment 9, and I ask Jenny Mara to move or not move.
To move, Presiding Officer.
The question therefore is that amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. Therefore, there will be a division. And this is also a 30-second division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 10 in the name of Jenny Mara is yes 42, no 78. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed, and that takes us on to Group 2, preparation of rules by Council. And I call amendment 11 in the name of Jenny Mara in a group on its own, and I ask Jenny Mara to move and speak to amendment 11.
Presiding Officer, amendment 11 would oblige the Council to consult on changes to the rules of court. I pressed this amendment at stage 2 and I am raising it again today because I have not heard convincing arguments from the Scottish Government as to why the Council should not be obliged to consult. As I said at stage 2, several organisations that represent court users in Scotland, such as Scottish Women's Aid, have said that the opportunity to engage on the proposed changes would ensure that they provide a better service. Similarly, I made the argument that the Council would also benefit from a wider range of views on proposed changes, as it would be able to make more informed decisions. In response, the Cabinet Secretary stated that in many cases rules make technical changes to give effect to subordinate or primary legislation, and for that reason it was undesirable to consult. However, the rules of court can make substantive changes to the advice and assistance that organisations give to court users, and too often they feel they have not had the opportunity to engage with this process. On the Labour benches, we still believe that a statutory obligation to consult would ensure the Council is as open and transparent as it can be, making what is often a difficult job for organisations like Women's Aid much easier. Presiding Officer, I'd like to press my amendment.
Cabinet Secretary.
Amendment 11 places a duty on the Council to consult. The bill currently gives the Council flexibility in this regard. It will have broad powers to consult on any issue within its remit. Consultation is not an unknown practice to the existing Rules Council, but this new body, with new functions and powers, will operate in a more inclusive manner. And I'd like to reassure members that the Council will not operate as a closed shop. Indeed, I do not think the bill, which opens up the current arrangement significantly, would allow it, and I consider it would be disproportionate and undesirable to require the Council to consult prior to preparing every set of rules. In many cases, rules will take forward technical changes purely to give effect to primary or subordinate legislation, the subject matter of which may have already been subject to extensive consultation and which will have already been considered by Parliament. And occasionally rules may need to be changed urgently to correct some defect which has become apparent, perhaps by a judicial ruling. I know that many organisations, such as Citizens Advice Scotland and Scottish Women's Aid, wish to engage with the Council to help it deliver improvements to the Scottish civil justice system. These are exactly the types of organisations I expect will field candidates for membership of the Council and the types of organisation that the Council will wish to engage with. I can assure the Parliament there will be scope for all kinds of individuals and organisations to contribute to the Council's work through its committees, through consultation and indeed by carrying out research. The power to commission research was the subject of amendment by Jenny Mara at stage 2. That power will aid the Council in its role to review and advise on improvements to the civil justice system, and I was more than happy to support its inclusion. I expect, and the Lord President has indicated, that the Council will depend heavily on its committees, where I would imagine much of its day-to-day work will be carried out, and it will consult more widely when it's appropriate to do so. As I stated when this amendment came before the Justice Committee, I believe the broad power to consult to be sufficient, and do not therefore consider it necessary to place upon it the inflexible statutory duty contained in Amendment 11, and I urge Jerry Mara to withdraw the amendment.
Thank you. I now call on Jenny Mara to wind up, and having moved the amendment, indicate whether you wish to press or withdraw.
Presiding Officer, I think it's the statutory duties that the Cabinet Secretary refers to that we're very keen to have, because it is these that afford the public the most protection. And he talks about last-minute changes of rules, but it's exactly that kind of process, a last-minute change of rule, that can lead to unintended consequences. And I would urge the Cabinet Secretary to reconsider to make it a fair and transparent consultation process and support this amendment. I would like to press it.
Thank you. The question then is that Amendment 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament is not agreed. This is the first amendment of this particular group, so it will be a 1-minute division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 11 in the name of Jenny Mara is yes 42, no 78. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendment 12 in the name of Jenny Mara, which has already been debated with amendment 9, and I ask Jenny Mara to move or not move. The amendment is not moved. That then brings us to Group 3, Composition of Council, and I call Amendment 13 in the name of Jenny Mara, which is grouped with Amendments 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 and 21, and I ask Jenny Mara to move Amendment 13 and speak to all of the amendments in the group.
With the exception of Amendment 17, these amendments seek to open up the Council's main decision-making body to increased lay representation. Amendment 13 affords the Council at least 2 but not more than 4 judicial members, and Amendments 14 and 15 settle the number of advocate and solicitor members of the Council to 2 each instead of at least 2. These make way for Amendment 16, which significantly bolsters lay representation on the Council to include those who have experience and knowledge of consumer affairs, persons with knowledge of the non-commercial legal advice sector, and those that are able to represent the interests of different categories of litigants. Amendments 18 to 21 are technical amendments. As was mentioned at stage 2, we have the opportunity to open up our judicial decision-making structures to a significant number of different parties that currently can't contribute in as meaningful a way as they would like. As we discovered while we were taking evidence in the Justice Committee, many of these organisations work directly with litigants and are constantly frustrated in the way in which decision-making councils create rules that do not fully consider the needs of litigants when implemented. It is our belief that these amendments provide a reasonable compromise between the need for legal expertise on the one hand and the need for expertise in a significant number of related fields on the other. In relation to the concern that increasing lay representation would risk technical rule changes not being fully understood, I argued at stage 2 that lay organisations have legally trained staff that can bring the suitable legal knowledge and insight to make a valuable contribution. In response to that point, the Cabinet Secretary said he would reflect, but unfortunately it appears that no willingness to take action, but I would encourage him to perhaps reflect further today at stage 3. Amendment 17 again seeks to ensure the gender balance of the Council is equitable. I have heard no good reason why we should not take action to rectify a legal system whose decision-making bodies are intrinsically skewed in their gender balance. As I stated at stage 2, the Law Commission's board is comprised 80% of men, the Judicial Appointments Board 70%, and the Scottish Court Service Board is 68% male. It simply isn't good enough to pay lip service to the need for greater gender parity and then sit back in the face of facts like these without doing what we can, and doing what we can quite simply to help rectify it. In many instances, our courts and justice system more widely impact women disproportionately, and I believe it would show foresight on behalf of the Scottish Government if we could finally recognise the part we have in ensuring this burden is made easier. I move my amendments, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now call on Annabel Goldie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I've listened with care to what Jenny Mara says, but I find it difficult to support what she seeks to achieve. It seems to me that her amendments, however well intended, actually become restrictive and introduce inflexibility. And for that reason, Deputy Presiding Officer, because all the amendments are roughly in the same vein, my party would not be minded to support them. In relation to the gender quota for the Council, I have every sympathy, again, with what she's trying to achieve. I just don't think this is an appropriate measure to introduce at this point in relation to this Council. I think female talent in Scotland, particularly, if I may say so, in the legal profession, is manifest, and I'm sure that that will become very obvious, and the Lord President will be particularly mindful of his obligation to ensure true representation on the Council.
Thank you. Alison McGuinness.
Well, thank you. The Justice Committee took evidence on the membership of the Council, and we heard the Lord President's assurances that a wide range of interests and users would be represented via his own appointments. And I don't doubt that, but I would prefer from the outset a diverse range of members, properly reflecting the end users, and therefore I share Jenny Mara's desire to have a greater lay representation. I don't accept the view that has been expressed, at least in some of the committee debate, that we need a two-stage process for this Council, only later drawing in full lay membership. So I think the amendment by Jenny Mara brings a reasonable balance to the membership, and we'll support that. Turning to gender balance, I support the intention behind this amendment. Members will know that until recently I've been very reluctant to argue for quotas, but it's very clear that voluntary action is not working. And we should consider taking this small step forward whenever we set up new bodies, and then we might finally be making some progress.
Roderick Campbell, briefly, please.
A number of organisations believe they should have a mandatory position on the Council, including the ABI in the form of insurance claims managers, with whom I have dealings. But I think once you go down the route of trying to specify one over the other, then you get into problems. We know that the Lord President believes a key role of the Council initially is in technical drafting, and I believe it's right that we should give the Lord President flexibility and not preclude him from appointing who he wants to in this initial early task. As has been suggested, we can change the mandatory appointments by statutory instrument in due course, and I think it's right, and I should declare as a member of the Faculty of Advocates, that advocates and solicitors are not precluded from undertaking any of the LP appointments.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
surround the categories and levels of membership first. These would fundamentally alter the Council's membership. The amendments increase the mandatory minimum membership from 14 to 18 and provide that none of the Lord President's discretionary appointments may be judges, practising solicitors or advocates. Jenny Mara said at stage 2, many organisations with legally trained personnel would bring both the necessary knowledge and insight to the Council. I agree. However, I believe these amendments would mean a large number of such very suitable candidates, lawyers working for voluntary organisations or consumer bodies or academics who also practice, could not sit on the Council. Such individuals, although members of the profession, would not sit in the body as representatives of the profession. This was subject to some discussion at stage 2, and having reflected on the matter as I undertook to do, I remain of the view that the bill, with its provision for flexible appointments, strikes the right balance. It will allow the Council to take account of the range of interests in civil justice and of the technical expertise for its detailed work, without creating an unduly large and unwieldy body. Civil justice issues are important to many different people and organisations across Scotland, and I have been personally contacted by a range of groups who wish better representation on the Council, including the judiciary, the legal profession and the insurance industry. Indeed, I recall David McCletchy at stage 1 questioning whether there should be more solicitor members. I agree benefits to court users and the public should be core to the Council's work, and I welcome and encourage lay input. The bill guarantees representatives on the Council with experience and knowledge of consumer affairs and awareness of the interests of litigants. Further, the bill now allows for a lay deputy chair. The Council will initially be responsible for implementing the many procedural changes required to effect civil courts reform. It will later turn its focus to reviewing and developing the civil justice system. Its membership must be able to reflect both roles, and as such, the bill provides for an appropriate balance of expertise, both on court rules and policy issues. It also allows the Council to evolve over time as it moves from its rule drafting focus. And if that evolution does not occur, ministers with Parliament's approval will be able to amend the membership levels. It is simply not possible to give all those who wish it a seat in the Council. It's unrealistic to do so and expect it to function effectively. But as I have discussed, membership is not the only means of having a voice in its activities. I am of the view that the lack of consensus around this issue indicates the need for flexibility, and I believe that it is achieved by allowing the Lord President the discretion provided for. These amendments would deprive the Council of the flexibility and capability necessary for it to carry out its functions effectively. The subject matter of Amendment 17 has been previously debated in relation to this and other bodies. I remain of the view that equality of opportunity for women and men and other groups must be addressed, but I am not persuaded that quotas for specialist expert bodies is the right approach. At stage 1, Alison McInnes and Malcolm Chisholm both asked that I consider the issue of transparency of appointments. Having reflected at stage 2, I proposed and the Justice Committee agreed to insert principles that appointments are to be made fairly and open to all eligible persons. I would hope that this would go some way to address some of Ms Mara's concerns, and I would urge Ms Mara to withdraw Amendment 13 and not to move Amendments 14 to 21.
Thank you. Jenny Mara, to wind up and press to withdraw your amendment, please.
Presiding Officer, I feel quite strongly that it is exactly the same principle that's at stake here in terms of the composition of the Council and the gender amendments, because flexible appointments to this date favour the status quo, and it is our role as legislators to allow everyone to be represented on these councils and to have a fair balance of gender representation on our public bodies that are in charge of decisions that affect everyone in Scotland. It is our job as legislators to be progressive. These are simple measures, they are not difficult measures for the Scottish Government to take, and they would be progressive. On the gender amendment, as I have said before in this chamber, the SNP are very willing to talk the talk on being progressive, but are very reluctant to walk the walk. And I would ask the Cabinet Secretary to reconsider on these amendments.
Are you pressing your amendment? Are you pressing your amendment?
Pressing, yes.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a 1-minute division. result of the vote on amendment number 13 in the name of Jenny Mara is yes 44, no 75. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendment 14 in the name of Jenny Mara, already debated with amendment 13. Jenny Mara, to move or not move?
Move.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will now be a division. The result of the vote on amendment number 14 in the name of Jenny Mara is yes 41, no 75. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendment 15 in the name of Jenny Mara, already debated with amendment 13. Jenny Mara, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 15 in the name of Jenny Mara is yes 43, no 76. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendment 16 in the name of Jenny Mara, already debated with amendment 13. Ms Mara, to move or not move?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 16 in the name of Jenny Mara is yes 44, no 75. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendment 17 in the name of Jenny Mara, already debated with amendment 13. Jenny Mara, to move or not move?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 17 in the name of Jenny Mara is yes 42, no 77. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendment 18 in the name of Jenny Mara, already debated with amendment 13. Ms Mara, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I now call amendment 19 in the name of Jenny Mara, already debated with amendment 13. Ms Mara, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. Call amendment 20 in the name of Jenny Mara, already debated with amendment 13. Move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. Call amendment 21 in the name of Jenny Mara, already debated. I beg your pardon. Call Amendment 21 in the name of Jenny Mara, already debated with Amendment 13. Ms Mara, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. So we now move to Group 4, Council Proceedings in Public, and I call Amendment 22 in the name of Jenny Mara and a group of its own. Jenny Mara, to move and speak to Amendment 22, please.
Presiding Officer, Amendment 22 would ensure that the meetings of the Council and its committees are held in public, with agendas, papers and reports published for the public view. Again, I pressed this amendment as Stage 2 and was urged by Kenny MacAskill to reject it on the grounds that there may not be a room available in our court service to facilitate public access to such meetings, and that the Council is merely advisory. Unfortunately, I see those arguments as incredibly weak, and they do not stack up. In terms of practicality, I do not believe that the Scottish Court Service would have a problem finding a room with public access for these meetings. If there is concern about the ability to hold open and frank discussions in the way that advisory bodies often have to, we believe that these fears are allayed by the clause in the amendment that affords the Council the option to hold proceedings in private in such situations. Holding our institutions to the highest standard of public scrutiny is an aim that we should all be united behind, and something we should be active in promoting in our legislation. Putting in place these measures would ensure that lay organisations, litigants and the wider public are more informed about proposed changes to our civil justice system. I can see no reason why this amendment shouldn't be accepted by the Scottish Government today. I move the amendment in my name.
Yep. Thank you. And as we have reached the agreed time limit under Rule 9.8.4a, I consider it necessary to allow the debate on this group to continue beyond the limit in order to avoid the debate being unreasonably curtailed. I now call Annabel Goldie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think it only right that Jenny Mara's persistence, tenacity and fortitude be rewarded, and it is with pleasure I intimate my party will support this amendment, because I think she makes a very good point. As far as I can see, the whole thrust of Part 1 is about transparency, about openness, about involving other people. And if it is a case that the Scottish Government's excuse for not accepting that is lack of accommodation, that seems less than lame. Bring them here. It will be lovely to have them. We can all watch the proceedings. So I rise to support Jenny Mara's amendment.
Thank you. Now call the Cabinet Secretary.
Jenny Mara is correct that certain public bodies should hold proceedings publicly. Nevertheless, I am not persuaded that this Council must do so. The Council, being essentially advisory in nature, differs from bodies required to hold proceedings in public. As explained to the Justice Committee at Stage 2, local police or fire boards, for example, have different purposes and functions from those of the proposed Council. Where bodies are responsible for service delivery or the allocation of public funds, a right of access is appropriate. Although this Council will consider important issues, it is not a final decision maker. That said, I have taken care to ensure an appropriate degree of transparency and accountability applies to Council proceedings. The Council will lay annual reports and business plans before Parliament. If Parliament wishes to publicly consider any of these issues raised, it will. Court rules are already laid before Parliament and published, and Parliament's consideration of rules is a matter of public record. While the existing councils do not meet in public, they do publish minutes of their proceedings online, and the Lord President has assured me that he intends the new council will be more proactive in this regard. More importantly, FOI coverage will be extended to both the new council and the Criminal Court Rules Council. Subordinate legislation will soon be brought to Parliament in that regard. This will provide for more robust arrangements, as the discretion of Ms Mara's amendment will not apply. The issues around practicability are not insignificant. Suitable arrangements, particularly for potentially costly accommodation, would need to be put in place, and that said, the Council may hold public meetings if it wishes. Those who have called for greater accountability are, I imagine, exactly those people that might become Council or committee members, and I therefore hope members will agree that this is a matter that can be left to the Council to decide, and I urge Jenny Mara to withdraw her amendment.
Thank you. Jenny Mara to wind up and press to withdraw her amendment.
I'm going to press my amendment, Presiding Officer. It's exactly this point that the Cabinet Secretary raises. Leave it to the Council to decide. But it's our role in this Parliament to make the best legislation we possibly can and put down rules that will go beyond the tenure of any Lord President. Presiding Officer, I believe it is the sign of a strong government that welcomes scrutiny and transparency. And I see the Scottish Government's unwillingness today to accept this amendment as a growing trend in the SNP to move meetings into private session, both in this Parliament, in committees, an increasing amount of business in this Parliament going into private session in committees and in councils across this country. Presiding Officer, I'm going to move the amendment in my name.
The question is that Amendment 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a 1-minute division. Result of the vote on Amendment number 22 in the name of Jenny Mara is yes 54, no 65. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We now move to Group 5, which is about determining liability for contributions. And I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 2 and 24. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 1 and speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Amendments 1 and 2 have the effect of raising the threshold for disposable income above which a contribution to criminal legal aid will be made from £68 to £82. These amendments reflect concerns expressed by members in the Law Society of Scotland that the original threshold of £68 might compromise access to justice. I made it clear to the Justice Committee colleagues during Stage 2 that I would be happy to reconsider the threshold levels, and this is the outcome of that consideration. The impact of this change is that we now expect 88% of applicants will not make any contribution to their criminal legal aid fee, increased from 82% in the original proposals. I also intend to make the same change to the thresholds for civil legal aid, preserving the important principle that, so far as is practical, there should be parity of treatment between civil and criminal legal aid. The bill is, of course, not about civil legal aid. I intend to make that change using the existing powers in the 1986 Act. We are working with the Scottish Legal Aid Board and the Law Society to finalise the resultant adjustment to the calculation tables that appear in the current draft regulations. The intention is to ensure that those at the lower end of the disposable income scale benefit from the change, albeit marginally in some cases. Those at the middle stay about the same, and those at the top end of the scale see a slight increase in likely contributions. The change will also benefit lawyers who will now see a reduction in the number of clients from whom they will need to collect contributions, and a smaller contribution due from clients with a lower disposable income. Amendment 24 would amend the planned arrangements for dealing with the income and expenditure of partners when assessing a person's contribution. It would also supplement provision already made in the Legal Aid Scotland Act 1986 about how disposable income and disposable capital should be determined. Our detailed proposals for how disposable income and disposable capital should be determined were set out in the draft regulations provided to the Justice Committee before Stage 2. The approach mirrors that already used for advice, assistance and civil legal aid. The proper place for this sort of detail is in regulations, as they can be adapted and improved in line with emerging needs. and of course future changes to regulations are subject to parliamentary process. The provisions in the current draft regulations allow for spousal or partner income to be considered as part of the contributions assessment, but the provisions also allow for the appropriate discounting of relevant income and the disregard of appropriate expenditure. Allowances are available for a spouse or partner and dependent children. In addition, there will be no consideration of spousal or partner income if any of the following apply. If the spouse or partner has a contrary interest in the matter for which criminal legal aid is sought, if they are living separately and apart, or it would be inequitable or impractical to do so. In determining disposable capital, the draft regulations already disregard such things as the value of the home, furniture and furnishings. These tend to be the main capital assets that couples own. I suggest the draft regulations already provide for a fair and equitable means of assessing what should be considered. The partner of a person charged with domestic abuse should not have the resources taken into account in assessing a criminal legal aid contribution, and they will not be. There will also be a degree of flexibility and pragmatism in the draft regulations that does not seem to be reflected in the amendment, reinforcing the point that these matters are best dealt with in regulations, not primary legislation. I would ask members to support Amendments 1 and 2 in my name and oppose Amendment 24.
Thank you. Margaret Mitchell is not in the chamber for understandable reasons. However, I understand that Annabel Goldie intends to move the amendments in Margaret Mitchell's name. So I therefore call Annabel Goldie to speak to Amendment 24 and other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I rise to speak to both Amendments 1 and 2 in the name of the Minister and to speak to and move Amendment 24 in the name of Margaret Mitchell. Dealing first with Amendments 1 and 2, I'm glad that the Cabinet Secretary has yielded to his metaphorical beating over the head and improved what was a poor situation and made it somewhat better, and my party will support these two amendments. Amendment 24 in the name of my colleague Margaret Mitchell seeks to include a provision in the face of the bill that will protect an individual on a low income who happens to have a spouse or partner. Now, the policy memorandum to the bill makes it clear that the resources of spouses and partners will be taken into account when assessing financial eligibility in most cases. As the Minister has indicated, there are exceptions when the spouse or partner has a contrary interest in the case. They could be a co-accused or a witness, or where indeed they are living separately and apart. However, any practising solicitor will tell you that ascertainment of a spouse or partner's income can present very formidable problems to do that either accurately or swiftly. And my colleague Margaret Mitchell's amendment will prohibit regulations to allow a spouse or partner's income to be taken into account when calculating disposable income, therefore simplifying the process for any accused who is seeking criminal legal aid. I move the amendment in Margaret Mitchell's name.
Thank you. Now call Lewis MacDonald.
These amendments take us to the heart of the weaknesses of Part 2 of this bill, and particularly the reasons why we saw industrial action in our courts over the Christmas period. I am pleased, of course, that the Justice Secretary has told us today that he has conceded the point that the threshold that he initially set was far too low, and that he has adjusted that upwards, because when we had approached this bill at stage 1 and stage 2, we didn't dispute the principle that contributions should be made by those who could afford them. What we disputed was the impact on the poorest people in society. And removing, as has been estimated, 6,000 people whose disposable income is between £68 and £82 is clearly welcome. So we will vote for Amendments 1 and 2. However, the Justice Secretary has said in introducing these amendments that the cost of meeting those increased thresholds is to be borne by those at the upper end of the criminal legal aid spectrum, people whose disposable income is still in the region of £11,000 or £12,000 a year. These are not wealthy people, these are the working poor. They will bear the burden, and I would be very interested if the Minister is able, in confirming his amendments, to indicate what he anticipates the impact will be in terms of the number of people for whom the legal aid that is available to them becomes such a token amount that it is easier for them to remove themselves from the legal aid system altogether. Amendment 24 in the name of Margaret Mitchell addresses another issue that was there in the original bill, and again, under the current ABOR system, it is only the income of the legal aid applicant which is considered. Changing that in the way that the Cabinet Secretary proposes to do, we think is wrong, and it's for that reason we will be supporting the amendment in Margaret Mitchell's name.
Thank you. Malcolm Chisholm.
Presiding Officer, clearly £82 is a bit better than £68, but it is not very much better, and I think it's very important to put that on the record in the context of this debate. We should remember what disposable income is. Disposable income is not for luxuries. For example, disposable income includes the money that you spend on food, and if someone obviously had a largest family, that could take quite a lot, if not most, of that £82. Now, of course, the Cabinet Secretary once again today is making a great deal of the parallel between civil legal aid and criminal legal aid, and he wants to align everything. The fact of the matter is he's doing the opposite when it comes to the next set of amendments on contributions, but we'll leave that till the next debate. But he wants to have the same treatment for civil legal aid and criminal legal aid. And he's used repeatedly, although thankfully not today, the example of domestic abuse. And that has been a good debating point for him, but the fact of the matter is you cannot build an argument on one example. I don't think anyone should have to pay, any woman that's a victim of domestic abuse or violence should have to pay any contribution. So I don't think that is a valid argument for saying that civil legal aid is exactly the same as criminal legal aid. The situation is different. If the state is against you, if you have no choice, and crucially, if you may well be innocent. And I think in this argument we're forgetting that many of the people who are accused end up being innocent, and that, of course, will be relevant to Graham Pearson's amendment later on. The problem with this bill is it has been entirely driven by finance. We all understand the financial difficulties that the government faces, but these are not enormous sums of money, and they cannot override the paramount interests of justice. The Cabinet Secretary has been forced to modify a very bad bill so that it ends up as simply a bad bill, but that doesn't alter the fact that it still is bad.
Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
I do not believe that these are matters for the face of the bill. It's historically been matters that are dealt with by regulation, and on that basis I simply move the amendments in my name.
Thank you. I now call question number 1. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. Call Amendment 2 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated with Amendment 1. Question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. We now move to Group 6, Collection and Treatment of Contributions. And I call Amendment 3 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Groups Amendments 4, 5, 6, 7, 7A and 8. The Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 3 and speak to all amendments in the group, please.
My amendments 3 to 8 relate to the collection and treatment of contributions. Amendments 3, 5 and 6 make technical adjustments in relation to appeals on behalf of deceased persons under the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act 1995. Provisions in Section 21 of the Bill allow a contribution in these appeals to be assessed on the basis of disposable income and capital of either the deceased person or the authorised person taking forward the appeal. These amendments clarify that it is for the Board to collect and determine the amount of contribution due in these cases, separately from the system in place in Sections 19 and 20 for determining contributions for other criminal proceedings. Appeals on behalf of deceased persons are very rare. It has always been the intention of the Scottish Government that the Board would collect any such contributions. The Board does not expressly state this, and the opportunity has been taken to put the Board's responsibility beyond doubt by Amendment 5. Amendment 6 is consequential on Amendment 5, preventing collection in these appeals being undone by regulations. Amendments 4 and 8 clarify the ranking provisions in the bill and those already in the Legal Aid Scotland Act 1986 about the order in which solicitors get paid. And Amendment 3 reflects that because contributions for appeals on behalf of deceased persons are collected by the Board, they do not fall into the ranking provision. The amendments clarify that the ranking provisions only apply when the solicitor is responsible for collection. In those cases, the solicitor is paid the net fee from the Scottish Legal Aid Fund. Any contribution payable is not included. In cases where the Board is responsible for collection, the fee payable is gross. The contribution payable is included. Amendment 7 delivers the agreement made with the Board and the Law Society that the Board should be able to provide a collection service for solicitors. The amendment gives ministers the power to require the Board to provide a collection service on behalf of solicitors, regulating how any contribution collected should be passed on and the charge for providing the service. Turning now to Lewis MacDonald's Amendment 7A, which seems to supplement my Amendment 7 by adding that regulations should ensure that the Board cannot charge a fee beyond the cost of recovery when providing a collection service for solicitors. I would argue that this amendment is not necessary. the requirement that the charge should cover only reasonable recovery costs, and the ability of ministers to regulate the board's imposition of a charge are already contained in my Amendment 7. It may be that the amendment seeks to allow recovery of the cost to the board as a whole, rather than the cost in a given case. This kind of detail that should be left for further discussion and agreement between the board and the profession. Further, the board must abide by the guidance set out in the Scottish Public Finance Manual. That sets out detailed guidance on the fees and charges to be applied by public bodies when providing services to other organisations or bodies. The mechanisms for public sponsorship ensure that the board must adhere to the Scottish Public Finance Manual, and I therefore consider the amendment unnecessary. I move Amendment 3 and urge Lewis MacDonald not to move his Amendment 7A.
Thank you. Now call on Lewis MacDonald to speak to Amendment 7A and other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you very much. The Amendment 7A does indeed seek to amend Amendment 7 in the name of Kenny MacAskill, and it relates to the charges which can be imposed or the fees which can be set by the Scottish Legal Aid Board in return for collecting legal aid contributions on behalf of defence lawyers. This is not a matter of mere detail that should be left to regulations or to future discussions, and I think by suggesting that, I think the Cabinet Secretary has put his finger on one of the fundamental flaws of this bill. This is a very important piece of legislation. It's introducing the principle of contributions to criminal legal aid in a very important and novel form, and it's not simply one where we should give permission for regulations to be drawn up to actually address the details. Because although the Law Society of Scotland accepts the general propositions in Amendment number 7, many of the bar associations across Scotland do not, and many of those lawyers who are members of both the Law Society and the bar associations believe that the Scottish Legal Aid Board is the best equipped to collect contributions to legal aid, with years of experience on the civil side, as well as the infrastructure for doing so. The full cost recovery, as outlined in the Government's amendment, is full cost recovery on a case-by-case basis. That still leaves individual lawyers exposed both to the risk that clients will not pay their contributions and to receiving an open-ended bill from the Scottish Legal Aid Board when collecting contributions racks up significant costs. The board itself has estimated that it would cost £600,000 across the board to take responsibility for the collection of contributions on an annual basis. If they can come up with a definite figure for the cost of those services to solicitors, it is surely reasonable that the legislation should reflect this and does not create open-ended charges that would be imposed on lawyers who use the board services. Amendment 7A would simply manage the financial risk to law firms by creating a set fee for the collection service instead of unspecified charges. This flat fee would, of course, incur the cost incurred by the Legal Aid Board in collecting these fees, and could be calculated on the basis of the figures they have not brought forward. A flat fee for the collection of legal aid contributions, I know, would be welcomed by many people who are concerned about the way in which this approach has been taken. It seems to me, from what the Cabinet Secretary has said, he has talked about detail and regulation. None of that seems to me to answer the question of why take a charge on an individual case basis rather than a fee that would apply across the board. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. I now call Malcolm Chisholm.
This is clearly another area where the Cabinet Secretary had to back down because he got things so badly wrong at the beginning. But part of the problem is that because the changes have been made so late, people do not yet know the detail of how it's going to work in practice. And that's why I support Lewis MacDonald's amendments, who's at least trying to give some clarity to it and not leave it completely open-ended. But once again, I think we have to state the fundamental objection to what is happening. And I know some people were a bit puzzled about my earlier reference to the analogy between civil and criminal. But when I first read this, why on earth should the Scottish Legal Aid Board collect, and indeed very successfully collect, all the contributions for civil legal aid and has all the systems to do that, and yet when it comes to criminal, it's being treated completely differently, and I certainly have had no proper explanation of that, apart from the financial one. But again, it's relatively small sums of money that are involved, and as against that, we have the risks to the administration of justice in terms of some people possibly not being willing to pay for a lawyer, and therefore they will not have a lawyer. In terms of some lawyers perhaps withdrawing from the legal aid system if they have to take the financial risk of that. So I still think there are serious problems around this. It's clearly better than it was, but I think it's very important that we recognise that the alternative system that was proposed by the opposition at the beginning would have been a whole lot better.
Many thanks. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary to wind up this debate.
Well, obviously, Malcolm Chisholm didn't have the benefit of sitting in the committee and listening to the answers I gave to the convener when asked about whether these matters would be considered in respect of civil matters, and when I said that they would, and the Legal Aid Board would be discussing with the profession. I think the fact of the matter here is that, given what is stated on the Amendment 7, and given what I have been given in terms of assurances, what the Scottish Public Finance Manual states, Lewis MacDonald's amendment is, I believe, unnecessary.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to then. Are we all agreed? We are. Call Amendment 4 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated with Amendment 3. Cabinet Secretary to move.
Moved.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed? Yes. Thank you. Call Amendment 5 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated with Amendment 3. Cabinet Secretary to move.
Moved.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. We now move to Group 7, which is about the refund of contributions, and I call Amendment 23 in the name of Graham Pearson, grouped with Amendment 25. Mr Pearson to move Amendment 23 and speak to both amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This amendment seeks to deal with an oversight in the drafting of the bill and to deal with an element of unfairness. Often we spend our time in this chamber trying to deliver fairness on behalf of the citizens of Scotland. In circumstances where an accused has been through the process of a trial and eventually found to be not guilty, and circumstances are alluded to by the judge which would indicate some reservation in terms of the conception that lay behind the prosecution, an accused in those circumstances can be satisfied that they leave the court with their character unstained, but probably their bank book will be severely damaged, having paid contributions towards their defence. What this amendment seeks to do in a progressive fashion, and some might think radical, but I would offer a valuable way forward, is to indicate fairness in our system, that where an accused person, having faced due process, is found not guilty, and the judge seeks to deliver a view that the prosecution was ill-conceived, the judge should have it within his or her power to indicate that the contributions made by accused in those circumstances should be reimbursed. I move the amendment and would indicate that I hope that others will support across the chamber.
Many thanks. And I call Annabel Goldie to speak to Amendment 25 in the name of Margaret Mitchell and the other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I rise to speak to and move Amendment 25 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, and also to speak briefly about Amendment 23 in the name of Graham Pearson. And if I take that aspect first, I have a lot of sympathy with what Graham Pearson is trying to achieve. I think my reservation is it's not going far enough, certainly not as far as the amendment in name of my colleague Margaret Mitchell would seek to achieve. But my basic concern about the way in which Mr Pearson has drafted his amendment is I'm at a slight loss to know how any court would interpret the phrase that it is in the interest of justice for the contribution to be refunded. My first question is whose justice? Is it the accused? Is it the taxpayer? Is it the administration costs of the court system? And for that reason, my party will abstain on Mr Pearson's amendment. If I may proceed to the amendment in the name of Margaret Mitchell, this amendment would require contributions to be refunded in all cases of acquittal. And her amendment is calling on Scottish ministers by regulation to make arrangements for any contribution for criminal legal assistance due or paid by virtue of this Act to be remitted or refunded in a case where proceedings are concluded without the person from whom or in respect of whom the contribution was due or paid being convicted. And I think it's interesting, Deputy Presiding Officer, that were the Chamber to accept this amendment, it would certainly put us much more in line with England and Wales, and I don't know why Scotland should be in an entirely different position. And I ask the Chamber to support that amendment, which I move.
Thank you very much. Malcolm Chisholm.
Presiding Officer, I think it's one mark of a civilised society how we treat people who are accused of crimes, particularly bearing in mind that many people who are accused are innocent. And it's that last point, of course, that these amendments focus on. And I think this is a particularly important issue if the rest of the bill is to go ahead, as the votes earlier this afternoon suggest that it will. So I do think it's very important that people who are innocent and who have had to make a contribution to legal aid should have that reimbursed. And I think Graham Pearson's words, in the interest of justice, suggest to me that that would almost invariably be the case. It seems to be completely unfair that someone should have had to go to expense someone on very modest or low income, and yet, if they're found innocent, still have the out-of-pocket, as it were, because of a mistake in many cases that the state may have made. Now, I know the Cabinet Secretary will say, well, if you do it for people on modest incomes, you'll have to do it for rich people who employ very expensive advocates. Well, that may be true in logic, but I don't think it is true in practice. I think we all accept that if people are going to employ a very expensive advocate and they can afford to do that, then we are not required to reimburse that. But I do think it is a perfectly reasonable proposition that those who are in receipt of legal aid should have their own contribution reimbursed in most circumstances if they are found innocent.
Many thanks. And I call on Roderick Campbell.
Whilst I have a great deal of sympathy for Graham Pearson's amendment, I think that we have to be fair to all private clients and all. So I disagree strongly with Malcolm Chisholm on that point. I think there's a general principle at stake. But I do think that this bill is dealing with legal aid on its own, so it would be inappropriate to support the amendment. But I would like it, and I hope I'll get some assurance from the Cabinet Secretary, that this issue will be kept under review.
Thank you very much. I now call on the Cabinet Secretary.
The subject of refunding legal aid contributions in the event of acquittal was raised during evidence sessions, and the committee asked that the issue was given further consideration. I set out my response to the Stage 1 report, the complexities involved and the wider range of perspectives I had considered. The committee considered 2 amendments seeking to refund legal aid contributions at Stage 2, now lodged for consideration again. It was the subject of some discussion at committee. In the end, neither amendment was supported, and in fact Graham Pearson withdrew. I think the discussion reflected the complexity of the issue, which I would suggest is not one for this bill, not least because any provisions made here today could not apply to any privately funded clients. This would lead to a differentiated and therefore fundamentally unfair criminal justice system. It should be stressed that the recovery of costs in defending criminal proceedings has never been a feature of the Scottish criminal justice system. In England and Wales, recovery of costs applications are made to the Crown and can be made by legal aided and privately funded accused persons. Recovery is for all defence costs, not just legal aid contributions, and it cuts both ways. The Crown may recover costs from a convicted defendant. Here, there is no system of costs in first instance Scottish criminal courts, either for those who are acquitted or those who are convicted. Changing this would be a huge and fundamental step, which should not be done without the fullest consideration of the potential impact. Prosecution is undertaken in the public interest on the basis of the test outlined in the Prosecution Code, that there is sufficient admissible evidence and that it is in the public interest to take action. That decision is made on the basis of information that the Crown receives from the police in the standard prosecution report and from witness statements. Sheriffs and justices of the peace do not see the information that the Crown receives from the police. That means a case may, on paper, appear stronger than it does at an eventual trial. An acquittal, or the conclusion of proceedings without conviction, does not equate to a finding that it was not in the public interest to raise proceedings. The burden of proof on the Crown to succeed in criminal proceedings is rightly a high one, of proof beyond reasonable doubt. It would not be appropriate for the issue of costs to be a factor in the decision-making of the Crown or for such a perception to be possible. While the 2 amendments both seek to refund legal aid contributions, they seek to do so in different sets of circumstances. Amendment 23 gives power for a court to order a refund or remission where a person has been acquitted and where the court consider it is in the interest of justice. What isn't clear from this amendment is the circumstances in which the interest of justice would merit the court using this discretion. Amendment 25 places a duty on Scottish ministers to make regulations about arrangements for refunding or remitting a contribution paid where proceedings do not conclude with a conviction. There are a number of practical difficulties with these amendments I would like to highlight. Firstly, where there is a judicial discretion, as in Amendment 23, it's unclear what would happen where a court chose not to refund on acquittal. Would that person be able to appeal the decision? Would they feel their acquittal was being publicly doubted? Secondly, where the refund can be made in any case where the accused is not convicted, as in Amendment 25, there are many circumstances in which a case will conclude without a conviction. For example, a case may be deserted because of evidence coming to light during the trial, where a case is dropped because a witness fails to attend, perhaps because they were intimidated or frightened by the prospect of giving evidence. The accused person would receive a refund. Are these the circumstances envisaged by the amendment? In respect of either amendment, it's unclear who has responsibility for the refund, nor is there scope in this bill to consider privately funded clients who would not receive a refund under either amendment. These points were raised during the Stage 2 discussion. None of them seem to be addressed here. So while I understand the concerns expressed, I cannot support these amendments. Even in their own terms, they raise many practical problems, but they also risk making a fundamental change to the justice system in Scotland with unclear consequences. And we surely cannot have a system where the many people who pay all their defence costs have no expectation of reimbursement, but those who pay some of their costs are treated differently. And I would therefore invite members not to support Amendments 23 and 25.
Graham Pearson to wind up and press to withdraw his amendment.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned differentiation in the way that justice is applied in Scotland. Throughout history, justice has always had a differentiation in the way it was applied. The progress that we make in this chamber is to try and improve sections of our justice and to take it forward, as I said earlier, in a progressive and sometimes radical fashion. The argument made is that we end up giving money back to people who, for some reason or other, might not have been justified in receiving that cash at the end of their prosecution. The amendment that I proposed indicates it's for the discretion of the judge, who's heard all the circumstances and knows the background, and will, in very unusual circumstances, I suggest, make a decision that that fund should be reimbursed. Bear in mind also that on many occasions those who will be reimbursed the funds will be those who most need the finance in their own family budgets. As far as the amendment proposed by Margaret Mitchell, I do agree that that opens up a whole range of challenges and a whole range of options that we don't fully understand at this time. I do press my amendment, and I do hope that members of the Chamber do support it.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will therefore be a 1-minute division. The result of the vote on amendment number 23 in the name of Graham Pearson is yes 40, no 65. There were 11 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendment 6 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated with amendment 3. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally move.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. I now call amendment 7 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Already debated with amendment 3. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved.
Thank you. Call amendment 7A in the name of Lewis MacDonald. Already debated with amendment 3. Lewis MacDonald to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 7A be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will therefore be a division. This will be a 30-second division. Thank you for the point of order, Mr Stevenson. We'll just check that. Thank you. Right, we're going to rerun that amendment with everybody's permission. The question is that amendment 7A be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And this is a 30-second division. We are not agreed, so please vote now on amendment 7A. The result of the vote on amendment number 7A in the name of Lewis MacDonald is yes 53, no 63. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The question now is that amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. Call amendment 24 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, already debated with amendment 1. Annabel Goldie to move or not move? Moved. Thank you. The question is that amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We have not agreed. There will therefore be a 30-second division. The result of the vote on amendment number 24 in the name of Margaret Mitchell is yes 51, no 62. There was one abstention. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And I call amendment 25 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, already debated with amendment 23. Annabel Goldie to move or not move? Moved. Thank you. The question is that amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will therefore be a 30-second division. Result of the vote on amendment 25 in the name of Margaret Mitchell is yes 14, no 66. There were 35 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We now move to Group 8, and I call Amendment 26 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, group with Amendment 27, and invite Annabel Goldie to move Amendment 26 and speak to both amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I rise to speak to and move both Amendments 26 and 27 in the name of my colleague Margaret Mitchell. I think by any assent, and it's already emerged in the debate and amendments, particularly I think from the contribution by Malcolm Chisholm, that this bill is at the very least controversial, Deputy Presiding Officer. And we know that passions have raised both externally outside this Parliament and internally within it. And what Amendment 26 seeks to do is to require Scottish ministers to lay before Parliament a report on the impact on solicitors of requiring them to collect contributions under the bill as currently structured. And the amendment would require a first report soon after the introduction of contributions, with subsequent reports every 3 years. Amendment 27 introduces a second, wider review clause, and it would require Scottish ministers to lay before Parliament a report on the operation and effect of Part 2 of the bill. And it is framed in such a way that the period begins on the day on which the first provision of Part 2 comes into force. And really these amendments, Deputy Presiding Officer, have been triggered by, as I say, the universal concern about aspects of this bill, about the way in which it has been drafted, about the provisions which it has created, and about the reaction to that from many sectors of society outside this Parliament, not least from the legal profession itself, and in particular those at the cold face of giving advice to clients under our criminal justice system. And I think Amendments 26 and 27 frankly introduce a very welcome breath of fresh air, because I can't frankly see what the Scottish Government should be afraid of if, according to all the Cabinet Secretary's assertions, this bill is a Rolls-Royce vehicle for the administration of criminal justice in Scotland. Then he can anticipate glowing responses to such reviews. On the other hand, if he's maybe got it wrong, and all is not well, at least this affords an opportunity for this Parliament and the rest of the Scottish society to have a view on what is happening, and it can trigger appropriate action being taken within this Parliament if, as I say, the responses to the reviews are negative. And I urge the Chamber to support both these amendments. I move both amendments in Margaret Mitchell's name.
Thanks. And I call Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Annabel Goldie makes a very strong case, in my view, for the need for these two amendments. A great deal of controversy has been occasioned in the time that Justice Committee has spent discussing the implementation of this element of the bill. And there's no doubt that there's uncertainty as to the efficacy of the proposals made by the Cabinet Secretary. Again, I would agree with Ms Goldie. There seems nothing to spook the Government in the proposals that are contained here. One would hope that the Cabinet Secretary would welcome a first-year review, as suggested in both these amendments, and indeed every 3 years thereafter. The changes in legal aid provision has caused a great deal of concern amongst the legal profession. Coming alongside some of the wider changes that may affect courts and other elements of the justice system, it must be proper that we keep a weather eye on these changes and know at the earliest opportunity, are they working well or are they not? I would support the proposals contained within these amendments.
Very much. Cabinet Secretary.
27 would place review of the impact of the proposals in Part 2 on a legislative basis. I have already made a firm commitment to the Justice Committee to review the impact of the proposals in Part 2 within 3 years and to present the outcome of that review to Parliament. Further, the Board has a statutory duty to monitor the accessibility and availability of legal services. The impact of these proposals will be kept under review as part of that duty. The bill also provides Scottish ministers with the ability to seek swift adjustment by regulations of the details of the new process, and I would expect that Scottish Government and Board officials will liaise about how Part 2 is operating and any need for adjustments. While I understand the intention behind these amendments, I do not agree that we need to legislate to achieve their aim. There is the risk that what we consider now to be the key areas of importance in the new process are not areas of concern in future. Amendment 26, which relates to regulations made under Section 33ZA, requires Scottish ministers to report on collection rates of contributions and the income of solicitors. A large proportion of this information would only be available to Scottish ministers at the discretion of firms. Moreover, there are a great many factors that affect solicitors' income not attributable to the Bill provisions. There is also a difficulty in tying down a timeframe. Flexibility in the timing might be necessary, perhaps to include other developing issues or because adjustments made through regulations need time to bed down. Moreover, the amendment appears to require reporting on 2 separate occasions in relation to provision in regulations about collections for each set of regulations. This means the requirement would be rather onerous. Amendment 27, which relates to Part 2 as a whole, requires a report to be laid every 3 years indefinitely, which may prove to be disproportionate. As mentioned during Stage 3 consideration of similar amendments, the Justice Committee can at any time consider the implementation of enacted legislation and carry out post-legislative scrutiny. Taking this into account, along with my commitment to carrying out a review, I am not of the view that reporting need be enshrined in primary legislation, and I invite members to oppose Amendments 26 and 27.
Thank you. Annabel Goldie to wind up and press to withdraw Amendment 26, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think that the Cabinet Secretary's response is predictable but not persuasive. In relation to his concern about the wider income of solicitors or firms of solicitors, the amendment is quite specific in that respect. It's actually about the collection of the contributions. And I think that what he fails to understand is the widespread disquiet which has surrounded this legislation and a very specific need to reassure not just solicitors who are involved in the practice of criminal law, but certainly to reassure broad sectors of civic society in Scotland, particularly those who may, in fact, be victims under this legislation when they find themselves as accused persons without the means of paying for their defence at the very critical time at the inception of proceedings when they need to do that. And I think, quite frankly, Deputy Presiding Officer, the difference between accepting and rejecting these amendments is you either slam the door shut on keeping fresh air blowing in this process, or you keep the door open. And I urge the Chamber to keep the door open and support the amendments.
So the question is that Amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will therefore be a 1-minute division. Is now over, and the result of the vote on Amendment number 26 in the name of Margaret Mitchell is yes 50, no 65. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call Amendment 8 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 3. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. I call Amendment 27 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, already debated with Amendment 26. Annabel Goldie to move or not move.
Move.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will therefore be a 32nd division. Voting is now over. The result of the vote on amendment number 27 in the name of Margaret Mitchell is yes 50, no 65. There were no abstentions and the amendment is therefore not agreed. And that ends consideration of amendments. So, we will now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 5479 in the name of Kenny MacAskill on the Scottish Civil Justice Council and Criminal Legal Assistance Bill. I'd invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I would call on Cabinet Secretary Kenny MacAskill to speak to and move the motion. Please, Mr MacAskill, you have 10 minutes.
To open this debate on the Scottish Civil Justice Council and Criminal Legal Assistance Bill. I thank the Justice Committee for its careful scrutiny of the bill during its progress through Parliament and the Finance and Subordinate Legislation Committees for their reports on the bill. And I am also grateful to the many individuals and organisations who took the time to respond to the 2 consultations on the matters within the bill, and to all those who gave oral and written evidence to the Parliament. There is almost unanimous support for the creation of the Scottish Civil Justice Council, but I would like to remind members why this new council, with its new functions, is needed. The proposals are founded on the recommendation in Lord Gill's wide-ranging review of the civil courts. Lord Gill concluded that far-reaching structural and procedural reforms are necessary to ensure Scotland's civil justice system is fit for the 21st century. The Council, which will firstly take forward the many procedural changes necessary to take forward Lord Gill's reforms, will play a pivotal role in revitalising and modernising our system. Following extensive engagement with stakeholders, I will shortly be consulting on a draft bill based on the wider recommendations of the Scottish Civil Courts Review. The creation of this council will mark the first legislative step on the path to reform. There has been constructive debate during the bill stages over the arrangements for the council, notably as to its membership and the extent of its role and function. On the membership, one of the underlying principles of the bill has been to provide for flexibility, balance and, rightly, a degree of discretion to the Lord President. This will allow the Council to concentrate on its first task, the technical rules revisions to support the much-needed civil court reforms, and, over time, evolve to take on its policy functions. I firmly believe that the Lord President should be trusted to achieve the correct balance necessary for the Council to assist him in carrying out his statutory responsibilities and to enable it to fulfil its duties in its most effective manner. Of course, Parliament scrutiny has helped to shape the proposals throughout the legislative process. Having listened carefully to views of stakeholders and to members of this Parliament, I introduced principles of openness and fairness to the appointment process. The importance of lay input to the Council has been discussed, and the bill now provides that a lay person may be a deputy chair, and I know Alison McInnes was keen to see that in the bill. And the additional power to commission research proposed by Jenny Mara will particularly assist the Council in its function of reviewing and advising on improvements to the civil justice system. When the Scottish Civil Justice Council, with the Scottish Civil Justice Council, will have for the first time a body with oversight of the entire civil justice system. The level of interest expressed during the bill's passage indicates how important and relevant civil justice matters are for people, families and businesses across Scotland. It is the prelude to further reform, but it is also necessary as a precursor to that reform that is contained in Lord Gill's proposals. I now move on to discuss Part 2 of the bill. Contributions to criminal legal aid will allow us to continue to target legal aid to those who need it most. by asking those who can afford it to pay towards the costs of their defence. To be clear, no one is being asked to pay for the full cost of their defence. If they can do that, they would not be eligible for legal assistance. We are suggesting that where someone can afford to contribute towards the cost, they should be asked to do so. That principle was supported not only by this Parliament at stage 1, but also by the Law Society of Scotland and other key justice stakeholders. I've listened closely to views expressed throughout the bill's passage to make sure we continue to protect the most vulnerable in our society, building on initial proposals to exempt those on passported benefits and our graduated approach to contribution rates. Now, disability living allowance and its successor and war pensions will not be considered as income when calculating eligibility for a contribution. Imprisonment or being taken into custody can considerably change a person's financial circumstances. Reassessment of eligibility when this happens will ensure the new circumstances can be taken into account. And my proposal to raise the disposable income thresholds means the estimated number of those liable to pay contributions has now fallen by 1/3 compared to the original proposals. These are all tangible improvements, demonstrating my commitment to ensure that only those who can afford to pay a contribution will. They are also good examples of where we have addressed a range of issues discussed with stakeholders. It is unlikely to have escaped anyone's notice that some in the profession are unhappy with the proposals in Part 2, and I appreciate that many firms feel that collecting some of these contributions is a burden placed on them at a difficult time. And while I accept that concern, I don't think it an unreasonable or unfair expectation. Discussions with the profession throughout the process have sought to address their concerns, including how to ensure that responsibility for collection is shared equitably. From the bill's introduction, we proposed that the Scottish Legal Aid Board share the burden by collecting in solemn and appeals cases, and to assist firms' cash flow, summary contributions will be treated as fees. In addition to responding to concerns about disability living allowance and war pensions, regulations will provide that there will be no contributions payable towards criminal legal assistance at a police station. Following discussions with the profession after Stage 2, my proposal to raise the threshold from £68 to £82 will significantly reduce the number of accused from whom solicitors will have to collect. Further, where a case transfers from solemn to summary proceedings, the Board will collect the contribution all the way through. Finally, I lodged an amendment to allow the Board to provide a service to solicitors on payment of a fee to collect contributions on their behalf. All these proposals have been accepted by the Law Society of Scotland, the profession's chosen representative body. Several other issues which it has agreed to in principle will feature in draft regulations to come. By all means.
I am grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. I accept the point he makes regarding his discussions with the Law Society of Scotland. What has he to say to the continuing objections and views of the bar associations in Aberdeen and Edinburgh and Glasgow and indeed many other places across the country?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm aware of those objections, but I deal with the Law Society of Scotland. That's a body required to regulate. It's a body with whom we negotiate. And as I say, a decision has been made, and I welcome the contribution by those individuals involved in the legal aid negotiating team who work constructively with us. So whilst I recognise many in the profession have voiced their wish to have no responsibility for collection, these are all practical steps that are necessary. And we must remember the many firms who already collect contributions from clients in criminal cases. Collection for them should not be a significant problem. But we are facing, by all means.
Graham Pearson.
Presiding Officer, I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary to allow an intervention. He mentioned that he is arranging for SLAB on payment of a fee to make collections on behalf of solicitors, was able to share with the Law Society the level that he anticipated that fee might be set at?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, no, I can't. I mean, that's a matter to be negotiated between the Law Society and the Scottish Legal Aid Board, and I'll leave it to them to deal so. But we are now dealing with a legal aid bill in Scotland for 2011-12, which was the second highest on record. It will not reduce without action. Projections for legal aid still exceed the budget set out in the Scottish Government's 2011 spending review, and difficult decisions still need to be made. So I have not approached this challenge by making changes to the scope of legal aid. Wholesale reductions to scope would have a damaging impact on access to justice, other parts of the justice system and society as a whole. Maintaining access to justice has been my key priority, as it has been for many others in this chamber. Reforms in England and Wales have been sweeping. The scope of civil legal aid is being reduced, removing legal aid altogether there for some areas of family law, housing and clinical negligence. That is not a road I am prepared to go down, and I am protecting the scope of civil legal aid, vital in the current financial climate, while making sure the criminal legal aid system continues to be just and equitable. To conclude, Deputy Presiding Officer, the passing of this bill will deliver vital savings to ensure legal aid can be targeted at those who need it most. It will also begin our journey towards a much-needed civil justice reform.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Lewis MacDonald. 7 minutes, please, Mr MacDonald.
Thank you very much. When we debated this bill at stage one, I said that we were in the familiar position of addressing a Scottish Government justice bill dealing with two quite different subjects. That was a relatively marginal criticism because we on this side supported the general principles behind both parts. Sadly, we are today in a position which is even more familiar because in recent months we have seen what happens when the Scottish Government ignores the views of others and presses ahead with legislation which is not fit for purpose. That is, for example, how the Police and Fire Reform Act appears to be viewed now by the Chief Constable of the new Police Service of Scotland. And that, as some of us heard at the lobby today outside Parliament, is how this bill is viewed by many of those who practice criminal law in our courts. Reform of the justice system is just as important as reform of our police and fire services. This bill is only the first of a number of measures which ministers propose to bring forward, decisions that ministers will be required to take in the next few months, which will affect the delivery of justice. It must therefore concern us all that ministers have so signally failed to build a consensus in support of the proposed measures in respect of Part 2 of this bill covering criminal legal aid. The Cabinet Secretary did finally find the time at the end of last year to talk to representatives of the legal profession and to offer some changes to meet some of their many concerns. But he did so only after they had withdrawn their services from clients in an effort to convince Government that their concerns were real and substantial, and after Mr MacAskill had resisted efforts by other parties and by the Justice Committee to insert the changes into the bill which were clearly required. We welcome the Government's concessions, late and reluctant though they may have been, because they do meet in part some of the concerns raised during the passage of the bill. In particular, we were quite clear that the proposed threshold for liability to pay contributions, a disposable income of £68 a week, was far too low. It would capture many of those in the greatest poverty for whom making any level of contribution to legal costs would be one extra cost too far. So we welcome the fact that the threshold has been raised to £82, which is more realistic, but of course it does not answer the question of affordability altogether. People with disposable incomes of £82 a week are still on very low incomes, which is why the working of the new system will need to be carefully monitored if those people are to retain fair and reasonable access to justice. It is clear from what the Scottish Legal Aid Board has told us, and indeed the Cabinet Secretary confirmed today, that the higher threshold will be paid for by increasing the contributions payable by those entitled to legal aid, but at the higher end of the income scale. SLAB has also offered us comparisons with the impact of changes in England. They expect the consequence of this change to be that many of those who remain theoretically entitled to criminal legal aid will in fact cease to have access to the legal aid system altogether, because they will be represented as private clients, because the assessment will leave them eligible for only a token amount of legal aid in the first place. SLAB's figures confirm that these people are by no means well off. A disposable income of around £11,500 a year is still poverty relative to the population as a whole, even if it is at the higher end relative to other people entitled to receive legal aid. So again, especially given SLAB's expectation that many solicitors will persuade those clients to go private, the impact on the new system on those at the upper end of the eligible group will again need to be monitored closely to ensure that they can achieve access to justice. We have also raised the issue of what should happen when people who have been drawn into payment towards legal aid costs for the first time are acquitted, and Graham Pearson very eloquently moved an amendment to that effect. The Government has offered no movement in this area, even on giving discretion to the judiciary to have contributions refunded only in certain cases, as Graham Pearson proposed. That would have been a modest improvement, protecting a few of those poorer people brought to court and then acquitted, but creating no general presumptions with implications across the justice system as a whole. It is a pity the Government did not see fit to take the opportunity to support that compromise position. Another critical issue has been in relation to the collection of contributions. One of the key arguments at Stage 2 was that the cost and burden of collection might of itself be enough to tip the argument for some solicitors against offering criminal legal advice in the first place. For small rural firms doing only a small proportion of criminal work, a decision to stop doing any could have an impact on access to justice for any accused person in that area. The Government has conceded that SLAB could collect contributions on behalf of solicitors. By doing so, it has accepted the principle of such collection, but the way they have done so again fails to engage with the concerns of the legal profession and will not attract the support of many. To provide for collection by a government agency would have been a useful support for the introduction of contributions, and again it is disappointing that Mr MacAskill has chosen not to take the opportunity offered by a Labour amendment to enable solicitors to seek that service without the risk of taking on an open-ended liability to cost recovery by the Legal Aid Board. If the job of government is to bring forward necessary reform and to build support for a reform agenda, it seems to me in this bill, once again, the Government is not doing its job. Yes, we support the principles underlying both parts of the bill: the modernisation of the civil justice system, contributions to the costs of criminal legal aid by those who can afford to pay. Many others support the principles too, but they continue to be concerned about the detail and the practicality of how the Government propose to implement these changes. It is surely a matter of regret that the Government's approach has divided the legal profession and left so many defence solicitors believing that the Government does not really care what happens to them or to their clients in this context. It is equally regrettable that it has divided Parliament and that those of us on this side find ourselves in a position where we cannot support this measure today.
Thank you. And I now call on Annabel Goldie, 5 minutes.
I thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I restate my position as a former practising solicitor in Scotland, although no longer a member of the Law Society and no longer in the role of solicitors. While I intend to focus my comments on Part 2 of the bill, I'll briefly mention Part 1, which implements one of the key recommendations of the Gill Review, and I think it is a welcome step towards updating Scotland's civil court rules. The Council will have a remit to review the wider civil justice system, and we should be in no doubt that that Council will be a very powerful organisation exercising very considerable influence. And I have noted the Cabinet Secretary's assurances at Stage 2 that the Council will act in an open and accountable way, and appointments will also be made in an accountable manner. But I do think it's unfortunate that amendments lodged by Margaret Mitchell at Stage 2 and the amendment which my party supported from Jenny Mara this afternoon, both of which were seeking manifest openness and transparency, to which I don't see how people can take objection in relation to the activities of the Council, were rejected by the Scottish Government, and I think that's unfortunate. But let me now turn to Part 2 of the bill, which I find problematic, and it's had a difficult time, Part 2. Indeed, the Justice Committee, I understand, came close to rejecting it at Stage 1, but had a change of heart at Stage 2, and we've heard from Lewis MacDonald the reaction from the legal profession, notably bar associations, 12 of them, including Edinburgh and Glasgow, remaining opposed to the legal aid reforms, and the Law Society of Scotland, while accepting the compromise offered by the Scottish Government, maintaining opposition to the collection regime. Now, my party has attempted to support efforts to improve the deficiencies of the bill, and certainly the increase in the disposable income threshold above which contributions will be made, and the agreement that disability living allowance, its replacement personal independence payments and war pensions will be disregarded is welcome. And it's also right that no contributions will be required for offenders in custody or in police stations, at least meaning access to legal advice at this critical time will not be restricted. I still think it's unfortunate that the rejection of Margaret Mitchell's amendment about seeking to exclude the income and capital of spouses and partners, which I think would have been a lot fairer to an accused who desperately needs advice and may need financial help. I think the rejection of that amendment was indeed unfortunate. And I do think that Margaret Mitchell's attempts to secure a wider debate on the whole question of refund of contributions, from which Mr Pearson was also making a contribution, I think that does invite a wider debate, and I hope that the Scottish Government will consider that and maybe reflect on what might be done. Now, Part 2 of the bill is underpinned by the presumption that those who can afford to pay for public services should, and as a general proposition I support that view, and indeed, if I may say so, welcome the Cabinet Secretary's conversion to the Scottish Conservatives' way of thinking. But that presumption must always be weighed in the balance against the specific situation in which it is to be deployed. And when that situation is the administration of justice and the fundamental right of an accused to legal advice, it's the responsibility of the state to ensure that those unable to pay for that advice are not denied it. And that's where, for me, this bill hits a brick wall. Because either the government discharges that responsibility with a cohort of state-funded public defence solicitors, or it creates a workable criminal legal aid system. Now, an overall provision of public defence lawyers, I think, would be very expensive and much more inflexible to administer than the criminal legal aid system. But in attempting by this bill to deliver a workable criminal legal aid system, I think the government has, in my opinion, failed. When an accused is unable to meet privately the cost of legal defence, the legal aid system must work on the basis that the accused is able to access that advice without being immediately confronted by demands for money which he or she may not have. And equally at that critical point, the solicitor should have confidence that the legal aid system will resolve what and when the accused is due to pay, and the solicitor can proceed without impediment to give advice. And I think the bill fails these fundamental tests. What the bill does is present the spectre of an anxious accused desperately needing advice, being expected to scrape around to find sufficient funds to unlock that advice, and the solicitor is then to depart from the role of adviser and assume the mantle of debt collector by hounding the accused for money. And if the accused at that point does not have or cannot produce the money, shoes for the children or food on the table may have taken precedence, the solicitor is placed in a professional and moral dilemma of what to do. Now, that isn't a workable criminal legal aid system. It's a dog's breakfast, and it's an affront to decent standards of fairness and the fundamental right of an accused to representation. And I think this bill raises significant questions about access to justice. I think what is predictable is that individuals accused of crime will be scared of seeking advice, may not be able to muster the funds to pay for that advice, and may end up representing themselves. And I think that helps neither them nor the courts. Deputy Presiding Officer, while I welcome the reforms to the civil justice system in the bill, I have to say that I think this criminal legal aid system being delivered by Part 2 is unfair and unworkable, betraying the most vulnerable, and for that reason my party is unable to support this bill.
Thank you. We now turn to the open debate speeches of 4 minutes. I call Christine Graham, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think I should also declare I was a former solicitor, member of the Law Society. I also have some sympathy, only in one little aspect, with Lewis MacDonald, in that here we are with another bill dealing with two distinct matters, of which I regret to say also Labour and Liberals in power were guilty of that offence, and we have not really cured that. But here we are. So going to the first part of the bill, the Scottish Civil Justice Council is very much to be welcomed that it will focus on preparing and drafting civil rules and procedure for the Court of Session and the Sheriff Court. These are terribly important for the effective and just working of civil justice. As my history teacher would say, a good thing. And I think at the beginning it will be very technical. It will be to do with the rules, so that we have the 4 judges, Court of Session, Sheriff Court, advocates of 2, solicitors of 2, and then the Lord President having a more flexible appointment of 6, referred to by David McCletchin. I regret he's not able to be here today. He brazenly said to Lord Gill, I'm talking about your 6-pack. Even Lord Gill momentarily was distracted by that comment. But it is important that there's this flexibility as we move on from procedural to more of the policy issues, perhaps more to what we might call the users. As regard to private meetings, I have to say to naughty Jenny Mara that even today at Justice Committee, you agreed quite rightly that we have 2 parts of our agenda in private, because it was housekeeping, it allowed us to discuss witnesses, and I do hope that Ms Mara is not going to say that it was sinister. I didn't think it was sinister at all. So there we are. Now, the background to the second part of the bill really is, as I think was said previously by others, there is a cost element. The Scottish budget has been cut hugely. The legal aid budget will fall to £132 million by 2014-15. We have to find the money somewhere. It's much better than south of the border. We have a 7.3% reduction here. It's 17% in England and Wales. It's not fair, but it's where we are as we go into a triple-dip recession. I'll not go on about who's to blame for it, but we're there. So we have to look at how we do this. Now, other jurisdictions have criminal legal aid contributions, England and Wales, New Zealand and others. And I'm not going to go back through things that have been said by Cabinet Secretary and others. But one thing I do welcome is the discounting of the partner's income, I say to Annabel Goldie, in the special circumstances where the partner may be a witness or an alleged victim of the crime. I think I've been most unjust to do it. The Law Society, of course, broadly welcomes the government amendments. It is... sorry, yes.
Yes, Annabel Goldie.
I thank Christine Graham very much indeed. And I think she makes a perfectly valid point. What I would like to say is, and I've had this as experience as a solicitor, as I'm sure she has too, very often the financial circumstances of the partner or the spouse may be exceedingly complex, and the point is they cannot be quantified or confirmed either swiftly or accurately. And that's my concern, because we've got an accused person needing advice.
Christine Graham, I'll give you a bit of time back.
I will concede that, because it also can be very volatile in certain circumstances. That's why I think the legislation in this respect has to be kept under review. I have to very quickly move on to the refund of contributions, which was raised by Graham Pearson. I think it's very attractive, but it has opened a huge can of worms. It is something that requires us to look at, for instance, do we start having awards of expenses in criminal proceedings? Can the Crown take expenses against an accused, for going to trial on something that should never have gone to trial in the first place? So I don't think that can be fixed here. But I do think it's an issue that's worthy of investigation, where the private client is in the same position, where the Crown is in the same position, but you can't simply insert that really complex matter into this bill. So I think that's something we will have to return to. As I say, in England and Wales, it's been, I think, the wrong choices have been made. This isn't perfect, but it's a darn sight better than removing civil legal aid from welfare cases, from immigration cases, from debt cases, as they've had to do in England and Wales. This way, we've made the best we can of a bad financial deal.
Thank you very much. I now call Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Roderick Campbell.
Presiding Officer, well, I'm glad to follow the convener of the Justice Committee, though I haven't really heard her use that argument before, that it's not quite as bad as what's happening in England, but it's certainly bad enough. But let's start with part one, which in fact we can welcome in general terms, although I do regret the fact that the Cabinet Secretary didn't accept any of the amendments that were so forcibly and eloquently put forward by Jenny Mara, because I think underlying her amendments were the desire to do 2 things. Firstly, to open up the Civil Justice Council to make sure that it had proper lay representation, including gender balance, and also to make the whole system more transparent. And I think that was a really important set of proposals that she came forward. But the second principle that she was trying to enshrine was that this Council also has to be accountable to this Parliament, and so that the recommendations of it have to go to ministers and thereby to Parliament as well as to the Lord President. And I was concerned when I heard the Justice Secretary say on one occasion today, the Lord President has assured me, because certainly on stage one, when I did speak at greater length on this subject, again and again the Cabinet Secretary was just leaving it to the discretion of the Lord President, who I'm sure is an eminently worthy person at present. present, but we do not know, of course, who future Lord Presidents will be. So I welcome the principles, but was disappointed that no amendments were accepted. Now, in relation to Part 2, I suppose I should be charitable to the Cabinet Secretary for listening or being forced to listen, but his listening has not made a good bill better. It has merely made a bad bill slightly less bad. Now, it's not that we are saying everybody should be entitled to have all their defence costs paid for. Of course not. There is already means testing in the system, and I don't know anyone who's objecting to that, but clearly what we're objecting to is the scale of the changes that are proposed in this bill. And as I indicated earlier, and in fact as some SNP speakers have really more or less admitted, it is driven by finance, and I am very, very understanding of the government's financial difficulties, but I do not think it is appropriate that something so as important as the administration of justice should be solely driven by finance, particularly when the sums that are to be saved are actually not, in the scale of the Scottish budget, very significant at all. Now, that is the underlying reason for the changes, but of course the argument that's been advanced is that we need an equation of criminal legal aid with civil legal aid. And of course the Cabinet Secretary has gone as far as saying he will amend the contribution limit for civil legal aid to enshrine that equality in law. Now, I think that is a fundamentally flawed argument. It is a very powerful argument in relation to domestic abuse, and I've heard the Cabinet Secretary say that on many, many occasions over the last few months. That's a very persuasive argument, but my own views on that I've already said in relation to I don't think there should be any payment at all by women in that situation. But the more general point is that you can't base a whole case on one example, and the general equation of the two situations is flawed, as I indicated earlier, because when someone is accused, they have the power of the state against them. They have no choice, and crucially, they may be innocent. And that is why I think the whole bill has been based on a fundamentally flawed premise. And I and my colleagues have very serious concerns about the people on low incomes who will have to make a contribution, and it's made worse by the fact that if in fact they are found to be innocent, they will get no reimbursement. So I would merely restate my very serious concerns about that. In terms of collection, I regret the fact that the modest amendment from Annabel Goldie in terms of our report on that was not accepted, but we do have to look very carefully at how that works out in practice, and indeed we have to monitor the effect of the whole bill. I'm being asked to wind up. I'm glad we're voting against it today.
Thank you very much. I now call Roderick Campbell to be followed by Alison McInnes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. May I refer to my register of interest, a member of the Faculty of Advocates. As Annabel Goldie has said, the bill has been a controversial bill, but Part 1 is less controversial. We've heard a lot today about the balance between lawyers and non-lawyers in the new Civil Rules Council. But let's not forget, again, that Lord Guild told the Justice Committee in evidence that the bulk of the Council's early work would, he envisaged, be the drafting of technical rules. I accept, of course, the balance between lawyers and non-lawyers may need to change over time. However, the Lord President has a big task ahead of him, and I believe it's right that Parliament has not sought to impose too many restrictions on his powers or to be too prescriptive in terms of the Lord President's appointments. The Scottish Government has made it clear also it will not preclude a layperson from being the Deputy Chairman of the Council, and I am sure we all welcome that assurance. I hope and am confident that the Lord President will recognise that his appointments will reflect a wide range of interests in accordance with the principles set out by the Office of Commissioner for Public Appointments, and I hope that the insurance industry, trade unions and others will be happy with the appointments when they're made. As to Part 2, despite the agreement on principle in particular that those who can contribute towards their legal aid should do, the detail has of course been hotly debated. The Cabinet Secretary has had a very difficult task in the current financial climate, but it still compares favourably with the situation in England, where some people with an income below the Scottish threshold would still pay their full costs in the Magistrates' Court, or up to 90% in the Crown Court, where I understand if a contribution is to be made, the minimum contribution would be £254. And as Christine Graham has suggested, English legal aid is faring far worse than the 7.3% cut that we are experiencing in Scotland over the next few years. But the Scottish Government has listened. It's increased the disposable income threshold for contribution, and it's accepted that these limits will need to be kept under review. And it goes without saying, if there is evidence that the limits were affecting the rights of individuals to a fair trial, then it would have to be considered further. On collection issues, again, the Government has, from discussions before the publication of the bill, accepted that SLAB will collect for solemn or the more serious cases. And whilst it's true that they've not moved on the principle of solicitor collection in summary cases, they do accept the need to offer assistance to smaller firms in the collection process, and that's been the basis of the amendment we discussed this afternoon. And to those who say that the change proposed in the bill is a break from the normal solicitor-client relationship, let's not forget that, however small, the current position in relation to ABWA, that's assistance without representation for guilty pleas in summary cases, while it may only amount to a collection of £154,000 per year, it's a collection to be collected by solicitors nevertheless. We've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence that solicitors did not collect it. Mark Harrower of the Edinburgh Bar Association said one of the reasons was because it might create conflict between solicitors and clients. It's never easy to ask for money, but it's stock in trade for solicitors and private clients, and that may from time to time also cause conflicts to arise. So it's not unique, and to oppose collection without properly testing matters in practice seems to me wrong. And we must also acknowledge that under the new limits, up to 88% of applicants will pay no contribution at all, so let's not over-egg the pudding. Let's see how collection works in practice, and let's see what SLAB can do to help smaller firms. And I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's assurance to keep matters under review, particularly the operation of Part 2. Finally, as to refunds, there is no tradition of reimbursing legal expenses in Scotland in cases where the accused is acquitted, in contrast to that in England and Wales, possibly due to the absence of private prosecutions historically. But I do sympathise with the view of many members of the opposition and recognise that refunds or reimbursement of expenses are something which need further thought, not just for legally aided clients, but for all. And as I said at stage one, it's a much wider issue, but I do urge the Government to keep the matter under review and not to kick it into the long grass. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call Alison McInnes to be followed by John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Had the establishment of a Scottish Civil Justice Council been brought forward on its own, we'd have been glad to support it. And although I would have liked to have seen Jenny Mara's amendment on the make-up of the Council agreed to, I still believe that the creation of the Civil Justice Council will prove to be of benefit to the development of our civil justice system. However, the benefits of Part 1 of this bill are not enough to counteract the problems with Part 2. While I acknowledge that there has been some movement on collections, I don't think the compromise is enough, and I see no good reason not to look to SLAB to collect all the contributions. That, though, is itself a relatively minor qualm compared to the question of contributions. Earlier today, I joined with the Protest for Justice outside the Parliament. Legal professionals and members of the public alike who are concerned about the potential impacts that this bill will have on one of the central tenets of any democratic society, fair access to justice. Reform of our legal system is nothing new. It's been put to me that there have been many changes to legal aid over the last 20 years, and always for the worse. But this is the first time that industrial action has been taken. And the strength of feeling on this issue is not for show, it's for real. The people at the heart of our legal profession, those who deal with accused persons day in, day out, are worried that this law will fundamentally damage justice in Scotland. And it's not, as the Cabinet Secretary has all too often asserted, about making criminals pay for their defence. It's about ensuring that all suspects, innocent until proven guilty, are able, whatever their circumstances, to access proper legal help, advice and representation. Since Stage 2 proceedings, the Government has been involved in, I think, fairly superficial negotiations with the Law Society and other representatives to seek a compromise. But once again, the Government's casual and I think at times bullying approach to lawmaking has been shown up. The Law Society, having been presented with the Government's final take it or leave it offer, chose to accept, pragmatically I think, but then they immediately did send out a briefing against the impact of the bill. Although the Government may claim that these changes are protecting legal aid while ensuring that savings are made, this is simply not true. Even with the higher threshold, the effect of the changes will be to effectively remove legal aid from a large chunk of working people. Anne Ritchie, the President of the Glasgow Bar Association, shared with me examples of the sort of cases she has dealt with in the past that this change would impact. These are working men and women with no previous conviction who were found not guilty. Had this threshold been in place when they went to trial, they might not have been eligible for legal aid, might not have been able to afford the contribution. And we could be faced with the prospect of more people being forced to represent themselves in court, but without legal expertise that they would lack the crucial tools to do so. And we will be risking sending more innocent people to jail. That's not in the best interests of justice. And the truth is that we don't know how bad the ultimate impact of these changes will be. But we do know that the Justice Secretary is willing to risk irrevocably harming access to justice in order to cut a comparatively small amount out of the legal aid budget that can never be cash limited anyway. And once this precedence has been established, we risk seeing a further erosion of legal aid in order to make more savings. Access to legal support is a fundamental necessity of a fair justice system. We accept the need for reform, but Part 2 of this bill is a blunt instrument that will have far-reaching consequences for justice in Scotland, and the Liberal Democrats can't support it.
Thank you. I now call John Finney to be followed by Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Civil Justice Council enjoys a lot of support and it has a very important role to play in the procedural changes and indeed now in the research. I'm grateful to the various organisations for their briefing, not least the Friends of the Earth, who, and I quote, said, "Ensuring that the new Council is established in accordance with the principles of accountability, openness and participation is a crucial step on the way to Aarhus Convention compliance. It's fair to say that the Aarhus Convention continues to exercise a number of bodies and individuals, and I recently wrote to the local government minister about it following last week's planning debate. Now, accepting that there are financial challenges, and I think members across the Chamber do, I believe we need to demonstrate these principles, not least as the Council will have a significant influence over the way that environmental law develops in Scotland. So dealing with each of these, accountability, I share some of the concerns about what effectively is the legislative patronage that this bill gives to the Lord President. Now, in his defence, as has been mentioned by others, it's been said he's a decent chap and he wouldn't overstep and all the rest, and I too have no cause to doubt that, but I think it's very clear that we understand that these powers are given to the individual post holder, not the present incumbent, and as Malcolm Chisholm says, there's no future guarantees. And just this week, we've seen concerns about a significant public appointment by the new police authority. So I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's assurance of scrutiny of how this progresses, and I'm particularly pleased that the public appointments were taken on board by the Scottish Government and, as has been said, the fair, open and accessible appointment process adopted, and the requirement for the Lord President to publish how we'll do that. Openness is terribly important too. Malcolm Chisholm talked about assurances, and if you check through, you'll find that there are a lot of assurances. There's an assurance from the Lord President that it's extremely unlikely that the Court of Session would object to the rules drawn up, and of course you'll note that the Lord President has a role on both of these committees. Assurance the Lord President would reflect a wide range of interests when choosing Lord President's members. And many individuals pay a lot of attention to those assurances. I supported one amendment from Jenny Mara, and that was the single amendment regarding the composition. I believe it's very important we have a cross-section of those involved, and I used the phrase lawyers' club. I did fear that there was a potential for a lawyers' club. And it's important the users involved too. Now, we've heard that people wouldn't be up to it, and we've heard promises of change in the future. And to many in this chamber, we've heard these statements from another forum and another debate. Participation, I think as we move forward, it doesn't matter how the numbers are juggled. I don't think that the Lord President should be in any doubt that people are very interested in his discretionary appointments. And what I would say that most effective organisations value rather than fear participation. The best employers consult with and value partition by their employees and unions. The best shops value their customers, and the best public bodies listen and engage. And I hope that the Lord President will do that with his appointments. Accountability, openness and participation are required. The civil legal system's customers hope for active involvement. I hope for active involvement for consumer and environmental groups too, and as a step to bringing the Aarhus compliance closer. And I wish the Council well in its very important role of keeping the civil justice system under review, and I will be supporting the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Graham Pearson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The rights and wrongs of this legislation I would like to put aside for a moment, but look at the approach that we've witnessed in leading up to our discussions in relation to the bill. The levels of consultation, no doubt, form large queues on various A4 pages of people who have been consulted. But what has become apparent is a lack of confidence on behalf of those consulted that their views were actually listened to and responded to in a productive fashion, not only in terms of Part 1, but also, as we've heard already, Part 2 of the bill. In looking at the headlines of Part 1 and Part 2, who could object to a Scottish Civil Justice Council and the aims that are set out in the bill for such a council? Long overdue, progressive, and one would hope placing civil justice to the fore and modernising what is, no doubt, a system in need of fresh air. Equally, in terms of Part 2, who could object to the principle that those who can pay should pay? It's logical, it's a desirable outcome, and it's one that many members of the public would no doubt support. So how have we come to a situation where we've had industrial action in our courts, a split among solicitors, an angry response from many solicitors who have tried to have their views heard, and a demonstration outside these buildings by solicitors before the Chamber meets to discuss the bill? The rejection throughout the passage of this bill, both within committee and here in the Chamber, of all amendments offered in terms of Part 1 and Part 2 are not edifying. The improvements that were suggested by opposition parties were meant to be constructive and make the Act, when it comes to pass, more acceptable to the general public and one that could be lauded by all. What we've ended up with in Part 2 of the Act, or the bill, is that as a result of the threats of industrial action and the well-publicised resistance from the legal profession of the changes that were to be made, we've had policy on the hoof, we've had changes implemented at the last minute, and as the Cabinet Secretary indicated earlier this afternoon, he had no knowledge of what the costs of some of these services might be for the future, and what we've eventually ended up with is that risk has been transferred from the Government to solicitors who will bear the risk of non-recovery of some of their fees and may well, in addition, have to pay costs to the Legal Aid Board for their efforts in trying to recover some of the fees outstanding. Mentioned earlier the injustice in terms of those who are acquitted, and that judges would indicate that prosecutions were ill-conceived, were rejected because of the problems it might offer. Christine Graham mentioned that it opens a can of worms. What I would say to the Cabinet Secretary is sometimes cans of worms need open. They can't be resolved at one swoop. If they could, they would have been dealt with a long time ago. But there's no doubt there are some cases that go through our courts that leave people damaged and in poverty. And if there is the elements that we could introduce that would make that better for the public, then we are duty-bound to introduce them. There's no attempt in the legislation to deal with those who would appear to come before the courts at regular occasions throughout the year. 3, 4, 5 and 6 separate cases that they access legal aid, and nothing has been done to deal with that.
Grateful if you could conclude, please.
I therefore, with regret, have to indicate that I do not support the enactment of this bill, and I will be voting against it.
Thank you. We now turn to the closing speeches, and I call on Annabel Goldie. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think this has been an illuminating debate, and let me say at once that I don't underestimate the challenges confronting the Scottish Government, but I think something has been shied away from, because Lewis MacDonald said that in this bill there are 2 entirely different subjects, and Alison McInnes alluded to that, and I agree with that, Deputy Presiding Officer. The reform of the civil justice system in Scotland is actually proceeding on the basis of an extensive and authoritative review by Lord Gill. There was a very well-informed process to justify how we might embark upon the civil justice reforms. And so, in that respect, I think that bit of the bill was proceeding on a stable platform. Yes, we want more efficiency. Yes, we want broader civic involvement with the Scottish civil justice system, and I think that's achieved through the Scottish Civil Justice Council. I have to say that I do think that Margaret Mitchell and Jenny Mara's amendments this afternoon would have improved openness and transparency, and I think it's a great pity the government didn't accept that. So I think we could have had, standing in its own, a very solid and a consensual civil justice bill. But criminal legal assistance is an entirely different matter. It is a challenging proposition. As I've said, I'm not underestimating that. But would this whole process not have benefited from broader consultation and a separate bill resting on what that broader consultation produced, with the aim of trying to unite people? Because it actually matters to Scotland, not just for Civic Scotland and not just for those who are accused of committing crimes. It actually matters that we've got a solid, confident, competent, professionally capable legal profession. And what we have is a legal profession at the moment which is split into pieces, and I don't need to explain that to the Cabinet Secretary. He knows it for himself. And I agree with Lewis MacDonald. I think the profession is divided, and I think that's very unfortunate, because I think the best way forward for this whole reform of criminal legal assistance would have been with information, real discussion and a meeting of minds and a genuine attempt to try and chart a way forward. Now, I have to say, at the heart of any civilised state is the right of the accused to legal advice. And that's a very important tenet, as is the presumption of innocence. And I agree with Malcolm Chisholm that such fundamental principles cannot be driven by money alone. But what the Scottish Government has failed to demonstrate is how these two basic principles are supported, protected and delivered by the Part 2 of this bill. And let me just for a moment look at the position of an accused. Limited income, no knowledge of partner or spouse's income, facing a criminal charge and urgently needing advice. Now, the disposable income that individual has, it may be an electricity bill, it may be a pair of shoes for a child, and what's the accused to do? Represent him or herself? Go to a moneylender? Try and pawn something for the contribution? Or, knowing him or herself to be innocent, and this is a really alarming prospect, plead guilty just to bring the matter to an end? Now, all of these are entirely predictable consequences of the provisions of this bill. And the client presents... Well, I can't. I'm in the final few minutes, I'm afraid, of my speech, Mr MacAskill. But what I am saying is that in a situation where the client presents an explanation which constitutes a defence, has to make a contribution, doesn't have the money, what's a solicitor meant to do? Now, on a one-off occasion, the solicitor might offer pro bono services, and those who have been in practice have often done that. But that's not sustainable if the majority of the solicitor's clients are in that position. And are they to be turned away? Is the solicitor to try and subsidise the inadequacy of the criminal legal aid system?
I'm afraid you must conclude.
That's why I think that the Scottish Government has failed to demonstrate exactly what it thinks should be happening and how on earth it thinks this system is meant to work in the interests of justice and fairness. And that is why, having failed to satisfy me on that test, my party will not be supporting this bill.
Thank you. And now call on Jenny Mara, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The creation of the Civil Justice Council was an opportunity for us to rejuvenate the antiquated way that civil rules are currently made. Organisations that deal daily with impact of the rule council decisions told us what we needed to do to make these decisions more open, accessible and easier to understand. And throughout the course of this legislation passing, Labour has attempted to put down reasoned amendments that reflect those principles. But unfortunately, today has been a missed opportunity for innovation, transparency and progress, with the Scottish Government instead content to sit on its hands and close its ears to the experts. Instead of opening up the membership of the Council so the needs of litigants are at the heart of our justice system, we have seen the Government doubt the ability of lay organisations to do that job, despite support from many people across this chamber. Instead of extending our commitment to public organisations as open, transparent and accessible, Kenny MacAskill's apathy has ensured that a closed-doors policy is the preferred modus operandi. And in the face of irrefutable evidence that our legal system is still operated with a deeply entrenched gender imbalance, the SNP has yet again failed in its duty to use the power of legislation at its fingertips to right this wrong. We cannot help but feel that the Cabinet Secretary's lack of engagement and unwillingness to listen has resulted in a bill that does not nearly meet its full potential. But, Presiding Officer, if that were not already evident in Part 1 of this bill, then the development of Part 2 makes it abundantly clear that the SNP still have lessons to learn about listening. The simple truth is that it should never have taken over 6 months, disruption in our courts and an 11th-hour intervention by the Cabinet Secretary for the Government to finally engage on their plans for our justice system. They knew, as we did from day one, that the contribution and collection system they put in place would have a profound impact on access to justice. The Law Society told them so. The Faculty of Advocates, yes.
Cabinet Secretary.
The fact that the government insisted upon there being parity for civil, which wasn't being insisted upon by the criminal bar.
Jenny Mara.
No, I would not welcome that at all. And I put this to the Cabinet Secretary in committee many times, that when a criminal prosecution is brought, it is the state prosecuting the individual, and so such comparisons are not really appropriate in this situation. The Law Society told them of the impact, the Faculty of Advocates told them of the impact, Capability Scotland told them of the impact, the Human Rights Commission told them of the impact, we told them of the impact, and solicitors up and down this country told them of the impact and continue to do so today outside this building. As Lewis MacDonald said, uprating the threshold of contribution from £68 to £82 does not answer the question of affordability, as the burden of that cost will still be met by those inside the legal aid system who are on low incomes. The SNP are putting the burden of this cost on the working poor in this country. Finally, Presiding Officer, the collection system that the Cabinet Secretary has cobbled together at the 11th hour of negotiations does nothing to mitigate the risk that we will see when people are standing in court without a solicitor, and that is a very real risk of this bill today. Presiding Officer, there is a significant risk being posed to our justice system by the SNP, but not just in this bill. In the coming weeks, Presiding Officer, we will consider contracting of legal criminal representation, and that contracting is allowed by legislation passed in the final throes of the Tory government in 1997. And that legislation was Section 52 of the Crime and Punishment Scotland Act. That section is the section that the SNP government is using to allow contracting over the coming weeks, months and years if they vote it through in this country. The Minister may like to cast her mind back, because she was involved in this debate in the House of Commons back in 1997, and she described this very legislation that she intends to use today as a ragbag of proposals that is almost incoherent in its approach. And I would ask her to reflect on her comments when she comes to passing this legislation in the coming months. Presiding Officer, the emerging story is that this government refuses to listen, happy to accept the advice that Scots will turn up in court unrepresented, happy to accept that the working poor will bear the brunt of this cost, happy to use Tory legislation to undermine the quality and independence of legal advice in Scotland. Presiding Officer, these are not concessions that we are happy to support, and we will oppose this bill at decision time today.
Thank you very much. I now call on Kenny MacAskill to wind up the debate. Cabinet Secretary, you have until 5 o'clock.
5:30.
Sorry, 5:30.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Notwithstanding some of the comments made by the opposition, let me welcome the juncture that we've got to. This is obviously a bill basically in two parts, and the matter relating to the Civil Justice Council, at least in some aspects, has been welcomed by most in the Chamber. It is a journey that we've been on for some considerable time. This is part of dealing with Lord Gill's many recommendations for reform. We last debated civil justice reform in 2009, but indeed Lord Gill was in fact established to carry out a review by my predecessor, and we have built upon that in order to be able to carry out the more fundamental review that he feels is necessary, and that I think most of us in the Chamber agree is necessary, to get the civil law and indeed the law in Scotland into a position fit for the 21st century. We require to make changes before the fundamental changes that will require primary legislation, and based upon his reform we do require to make other changes. Some have been dealt with on a non-legislative basis, others have been dealt with in terms of the aspect here in terms of the Civil Rules Council. This was a matter first raised by his predecessor as Lord President, Lord Hamilton, who made it quite clear that he felt that it was necessary that these changes were made if we were to be able to give effect to the more fundamental reforms required by the then Justice Clerk. Obviously, the Council membership has been the subject of much interest and indeed debate. I have to say that I do feel that the Lord President will require the wisdom of Solomon to balance the basis of who all wishes to go there, but I do believe that it's best to give him some element of flexibility. Not everybody can be around the table. Not everybody needs to be around the table, but I do believe that he, and indeed anybody who would hold that office, would ensure that there would be a fair representation that would take into account the balance of needs and wants. There have been numerous people who have sought a place within it who currently aren't. I've had representations from the Association of British Insurers. I've had representations from the Sheriffs Association. I've had representations from other legal bodies and indeed non-legal bodies. If we were to have accommodated everybody who wished to be there, then it wouldn't have been possible probably to have even had it convened in public, as some wished, within the chamber that we sit in here. So I do think that we have to have some trust and faith in the Lord President. It is a position that, as I say, is viewed greatly by everybody who has ever held that office, and I think, as I say, we should give the Lord President the degree of flexibility that is necessary to allow us to deal with that. That then takes us on to the next aspect, which deals, as I say, with the question of legal aid. Clearly, this is a matter which I think we begin to see some of the hypocrisy coming from the opposition benches. They were prepared to support the principle at stage one. They are not prepared, it seems, to support the bill today. Those parties who condemn it outright and yet who sit in government south of the border, where these matters are significantly worse and harsher. By all means, Ms McInnes.
Alison McInnes.
Are you telling the Chamber that the extent of his, as the Cabinet Secretary telling the Chamber, that the extent of his ambition is to be less bad than somewhere else? Because if that's so, he's got quite a lot of explaining to do.
Cabinet Secretary.
No, I have to say it's my ambition, and it's not just my ambition, it's the intention of this government not to replicate the absolute appalling situation that's happening in legal aid south of the border, where whole areas have been discarded, that people who we have heard crocodile tears put forward from around the chamber. Let's look at some of the matters where there is no legal aid because of the cuts that have taken place. Cuts that started not just under the current Tory coalition south of the border, but cuts that started under a Labour government under Jack Straw. Let's look at some of the business that isn't available for legal aid south of the border. Asylum, clinical negligence, criminal injuries compensation, debt, employment, housing, immigration, family and welfare benefits. None of them are eligible for anybody to apply for legal aid, irrespective of their income. This government is not prepared to consider such a scenario. That is why when we face a situation of the second highest legal aid bill on record, we require to make sure that we balance it, and we balance it by making those who have the ability to make a contribution in criminal to do so. Mr MacDonald.
Lewis MacDonald.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. We are here, of course, to debate the bill that he has brought forward. Yeah. Will he respond to some of the points that have been made regarding the impact of his bill and the way he's drawn it up on those on incomes just above the bare poverty level?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I will continue to point out, because we did hear from Annabel Goldie how appalling she thought matters were going to be here. But let's look at what the situation is south of the border. South of the border, in the Magistrates' Court, it's an in or out system. Anyone with annual disposable income over £3,398 just over £65 a week fails the means test and does not get legal aid. In the Crown Court, anyone with annual disposable income over £3,398 is required to pay 90% of that amount towards
Order.
costs.
Would members of this come into the
Let's
chamber
contrast that with what the situation
keep
here
order.
is in Scotland. 88% of people facing a criminal charge and applying for legal aid will have legal aid granted with no contribution. Only 12% will require to make a contribution. A contribution level in Scotland that commences at £3, where people who are earning several £100s who have the ability to meet it will be required to make a modest contribution. We do face challenges as a government. We do have significant claims upon the Legal Aid Board, many of whom are doing remarkably well from the amount of legal aid provision that they make to their clients. So we have got to balance matters. That is why I am extremely grateful to the Legal Aid Board for having brought forward proposals that will allow us to continue to provide for such matters as asylum, clinical negligence, all these other areas of civil concern, where we've taken on board the points of concern about the disposable income, and in doing so, not only have we dealt with the concerns of the Law Society of Scotland, but unlike Ms Mara, we've been prepared to make sure that not only would it go for those who face a criminal allegation, but it would also go for those who face civil matters. We want to make sure that there is parity by the person who is the victim of domestic violence with that person who is charged and alleged to be the perpetrator of the domestic violence. Ms Goldie also forgets that many people who face civil challenges also do face the weight of the state facing them. We have people who have their children removed, and yet they are dealt with under civil, not criminal legal aid in most matters. We face people who face bankruptcy or insolvency, the loss of their house, all of those matters that go with it. By all means, Ms Goldie.
Annabel Goldie.
But part 2 of this bill is about people accused of crime and their right to be legally represented and how they achieve that.
Cabinet Secretary.
Achieving when we have the second highest bill on record, when we have whole hundreds of millions of pounds going out, when we know that the largest part of legal aid expenditure goes on criminal legal aid. If we are to provide the legal aid system that we wish in Scotland, which I believe is one that covers clinical negligence, family matters, all of these things that are being rejected south of the border, then we have to make sure that it's dealt with by those who have the ability to pay doing so. That is why, as I say, I commend this bill, and as I say, I am looking forward to the Law Society of Scotland being able to work with the Legal Aid Board in a constructive manner as the matters that remain outstanding can be dealt with in forthcoming months and years.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate on the Scottish Civil Justice Council and Criminal Legal Assistance Bill. Before we move to decision time, could I invite members to join me in welcoming to the gallery the Premier of Quebec, Madame Pauline Marois. We now come to decision time, and there is one question to be put as a result of today's business. The question is that motion 5479 in the name of Kenny MacAskill on the Scottish Civil Justice Council and Criminal Legal Assistance Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to a vote, and members should cast their votes now, please. Order. Order. The result of the vote on motion number 5479 in the name of Kenny MacAskill is as follows: yes 62, no 53, there were no abstentions, and the motion is therefore agreed to. And that concludes decision time.